Okay, well, everybody got very silent, so I guess we can start. Hi, I'm Sharon Marcus, and welcome to the Global Book Review. Today's event gathers editors of book reviews in Italy, France, South Africa, Mexico, and India to speak with each other and with us about how the internet has and has not helped to create a truly global readership. We live in a global, digitally connected age when it is easier than ever before to read books from around the world. But for many of us, our reading habits remain resolutely local. We are limited by the languages we can and can't read, by the limits of computer translation, and here in the US, by the outrageous fact that only 3% of books published here each year are translated. One answer, of course, is to bring books from other countries and in other languages closer to us. Universities and book reviews, especially in our digital age, can both transform quote-unquote foreign literature into a shared stories of a global village. Universities and book reviews can connect readers around the world, helping to foster phenomena like Ferrante fever or the global success of Thomas Piketty's Capital. Both universities and book reviews can also nurture resolutely local reading, the pleasure of seeing someone on the subway reading the book that you just finished, or the pleasure that Columbia's first-year students take in all reading Plato's Symposium at the same time of year as part of our core curriculum. So I'm welcoming you here today in two roles. I have too many jobs. As the Dean of Humanities at Columbia University and as the founding editor with Kate Zaloom, who you'll meet soon, of Public Books. Like many universities, Columbia has been paying close attention to what it means to be a university in a rapidly globalizing age, particularly since we have long been a world university. Located in a very international city, Columbia University offers courses in more than 50 languages, maintains 8 global centers around the world, and has extraordinarily international faculty and student bodies. Magazines, book reviews, and cultural journalism of all stripes also contribute mightily to making the world's literature more available to everyone around the world. Kate Zaloom and I founded Public Books in 2012 to give academics a venue where they could bring their unique expertise to bear on contemporary culture and ideas. At Public Books, you can find an engineer reading Colson Whitehead's novels about railroads, scholars of prisons weighing in on Orange is the New Black, and feminist professors from Columbia's Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality assembling a syllabus on rape culture to help the public understand a term that has resonated here on our own campus and recently went viral in the wake of Brock Turner and Donald Trump. My current joke is that the rape culture syllabus is what you can just hand to your drunk Republican uncle at your next holiday event. Public Books has readers around the world and features authors from around the world. We review books written in many languages, including works that have not yet been translated into English, taking advantage of the facility with languages that most scholars have. We're very proud, for example, to have run a review of Álvaro Enríquez's Muerte Súbita well before the book became, in translation, the literary sensation Sudden Death, and then we reviewed it again in English. In fact, the reviewer is sitting here. And we have been delighted to form partnerships with publications around the world, some represented here today, La Vie des Idées in France and the Caravan in India, as well as with The Guardian in England. As Dean of Humanities, I've been collaborating with our over 200 faculty in 13 departments to make the humanities more digital, more public, and more global. We've had over a dozen humanities faculty members participate in the op-ed project. We have initiatives underway in comparative media, computation and culture, and global language justice, among others. And we have 12 faculty from almost as many departments producing a massive online open course, or MOOC, on the world's great novels, from The Tale of Genji to Invisible Man. Public Books is one more manifestation of the convergence of the digital, the public, and the global, and we've been delighted at how many Columbia faculty and students have contributed to our virtual pages. Before turning to our first panel, 2 final orders of business. Actually, I'm going to say 3, which is as soon as I finish talking, we should all, anyone who's standing you should go ahead now and just grab chairs. There are plenty of chairs, and unless you want to stand, Nobody should have to stand. So, first order of business is to give thanks for making this conference possible. First and foremost to our president, Lee Bollinger, for his extraordinary support for the global humanities. Also to the Italian Academy for hosting us in this beautiful room. To Veena Tran, the Executive Director of Deaconal Affairs, and Liz Maines-Amendzadeh, who as an ACLS Public Fellow has been an inspired and brilliant digital director for public books. And without Veena and Liz in particular, nothing would be happening right now. I also want to thank our managing editor, Stephen Twilley, our coordinating editor, Ben Platt, our former associate editor, Ed Winstead, our editorial assistant, Alexandra Hightower, and funded by Dean Carlos Alonso's visionary administrative internship program, our two current graduate interns, Alex Mendez and Julian Jurgenmeyer. One last word before we begin. In January 2017, we will launch what we are informally calling Public Books 2.0, with a spiffy website redesign, but the same URL, publicbooks.org, an expanded editorial board, and new content daily. But in response to those who have asked with worried concern, we're keeping the colors, the logo, and the font. You can find updates about the launch of Public Books 2.0 on our Facebook page and our Twitter and Instagram feeds, where you will also find many, many pictures of my very beautiful cat, because what would the internet be globally without cats? And we will also be posting photos there of photos and video of today's events. So now here to introduce our first panel is my co-editor, Caitlin Zaloom, professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU, and currently a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences.
Hello, everyone, and hello to our panelists. I'm really, really pleased to have you all here and all of our guests here as well to talk about the book review and the global era, or to actually talk also about the limitations of those ideas. Our first panelist to my right is Pamela Paul, editor of the New York Times Book Review. She's also the author of several books herself, including Parenting, Inc., and the editor most recently of By the Book, Writers on Literature and the Literary Life in the New York Times Book Review. Next to Pamela is Florent Guénard, who is a lecturer at the University of Nantes and the editor-in-chief of La Vie des Idées, a publication very much similar to Public Books, with whom we have had a long-standing collaboration. In addition to being an editor, Florent's research areas are mainly in political philosophy. So he comes to us with a veritable and formidable academic pedigree as well as editorial pedigree. Next to Florent is Bongani Kona. Bongani is a contributing editor at Chimurenga Chronic of South Africa, which comes to us from South Africa, although it is a kind of Pan-African journal. Bongani is himself a writer, and most recently his story was nominated for the 2016 Kane Prize for African Writing. And other publications of his have appeared in the daily assortment of Astonishing Things and Other Stories and in Safe House. And across from me on the stage is Daniel Krauze. Daniel is a writer and a film critic, as well as the deputy editor of Letras Libres magazine in Mexico City. I thought that we could start out with a question to kind of get us into the global theme, which is about how you envision your own audience in kind of geographic terms. So how do you think about your audience as a kind of national space, a local space, or do you not think in geographic terms at all? start with Pamela.
Well, we are the New York Times, obviously, and so at least originally a hometown and a metropolitan newspaper, although the newspaper, and even that word is old-fashioned now, the media organization made a transition to becoming a national paper decades ago, and in the last decade have made a real effort to become an international news organization. And that started, that existed before insofar as we co-owned the International Herald Tribune with the Washington Post, but when we took that over completely and then sort of rebooted it as the International New York Times, that accelerated. And obviously with the internet, that accelerated yet again and continues to accelerate. When we look at our readership, as every media organization does now and sees the audience data, we see our readers coming in from around the world. We publish stories sometimes that are more read in Brazil or in China, well, not China, unfortunately, bad example, or in India, depending on the subject, more than they are in the United States. And so increasingly our coverage, whether it's news coverage or culture or books specifically, reflects that general orientation.
Yes, La Vie des Idées is an online journal dedicated to non-fiction issues and non-fiction books. La Vie des Idées is in French, so it concerns national subjects. But we have a mirror website in English, which name is Books and Ideas. And it's very important for us to translate our French articles in English because we think that what interests French readers may interest readers in the world. So I think we have a global view of readership, And now I can say that La Vie des Idées is a real success because we have 400,000 unique visitors per month, which is very, very important in France. And we could be very optimistic when you see something like this.
Hello everyone, sorry, please forgive me if I start slurring. I kind of arrived from South Africa yesterday, so I'm feeling a bit out of time or in a different time zone. I come from a publication called Chimurenga, which is based in Cape Town, but is a Pan-African, sort of Pan-African publication. So we don't think in terms of readership, in terms of national borders or continental borders, but readers who share our sensibility, our way of seeing the world, our way of being in the world. So that's the way we kind of think of we approach readership, I guess. I hope I've answered the question.
Well, say a little bit more about how you see that view, who you're trying to reach in these places that might be quite far from the local place where you're editing Chimurenga.
Okay, I think let me just give a bit of background, if you don't mind. It's not a fully fledged lecture. When I started writing about books in, say, 2008, 2009, I wrote for a local paper in Cape Town. And what happened is that I went to see this editor. I went to see her at her office, and she had like a pile of books, and she said, I got your CV and stuff, but you can pick whatever books you want from that pile and give me a copy the next week. But all of the books that I picked up, all of them were from publishing houses here. Like they were all kind of, those are the publishing houses that have, I guess, the money to kind of send books to Cape Town, and they don't care if they get reviewed by a newspaper in Cape Town. So that, I'm getting to the question, I guess.
Keep going.
So I guess I kind of worked in that environment before I found myself in Chimurenga in, say, 2013, and what I realized from those 4 years was that in the same way that Hollywood films kind of crushed local films in South Africa because of their reach. They're not necessarily the best films, but they're the best marketed films. The same thing was happening with books that were from the continent, by publishers on the continent, by small publishing houses in South Africa. So I guess what I'm I've now tangled myself here. I guess what I was trying to say by sensibility is that it's coming actually. Jet lag, please blame it on that. I guess for there's a way about writing about our lives, about writing about. Sorry, let me take a step back. I guess what I'm trying to say is that when I was writing about books, the things that happened, the books that were left on the floor of this editor's office were actually books that were written predominantly by black writers from the continent. And they were deemed to be inferior, right? They were deemed to be of secondary quality because they'd come from a small publishing house. And those are the kinds of books that we prioritize, not necessarily where they come from. Yeah, I guess I'm going to stop myself there before I kind of choke myself.
Well, I think that this question of kind of what each of you reviews is very important. So Daniel, can you tell us a little bit about how you envision your audience, and maybe kind of lead us back toward Bongani's question of kind of how you choose what you review?
Should I say a little bit about what Letras Libres
yes,
is?
Please.
Yeah,
yes.
I don't assume that you know about it. Letras Libres is a cultural magazine. It's published basically in Mexico, but we have a small office in Spain as well. It was the magazine is a continuation of a magazine that was founded by Octavio Paz in, I guess, the 1970s. I might get the date wrong. If I do, my father is going to kill me. But after Octavio Paz passed away in 1997, I think, my father founded Letras Libres, which is, as I said, a continuation of the ideas, the liberal ideas of Vuelta magazine. And so we're published in Mexico, and 15 years ago, to the day actually, we opened an office in Spain, and we publish a version of the magazine in Spain as well. And we have a website, and the website has a Mexican version, sort of a Mexican and Latin American version of the website. And we have the same for Spain. So in regards to our global audience, we're sort of restricted by the fact that we publish in Spanish. So it's not, if you don't read in Spanish, you won't be able to read Letras Libres. There's no way, it's not translated in English. But we do try, even though we can't reach the whole world, or at least just the world that speaks Spanish, we try to bring the world into the magazine. So we try to be mindful of whatever is published in other languages, things that resonate globally. Actually, when you were mentioning Piketty and Ferrante and Nausgaard, well, those things we try to acknowledge them in our book section as well. Although we do focus more on authors, particularly Mexican and Spanish authors, but we try to review also Latin American authors and keep in mind that obviously that our magazine is not published outside of Latin America, as I said, and Spain. So that's the way we view our audience, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And how do you select the books or the films, in your case, or television shows that you're going to review? Well,
those are two very different things. When it comes to film and television, I think we do try to focus more on Mexican film, because in the Mexican market, as many other markets, I don't know if the French market is like that, the audience at least, they tend to watch more American movies than Mexican movies, so we feel like it's sort of our obligation to talk a little bit more about Mexican movies, or at least one issue for American movies and one issue for Mexican movies. When it comes to TV, basically, honestly, the most interesting TV shows that we see tend to be American, so that's what, whenever we write about TV, we write about American TV shows. When it comes to books, we do try, like I said, we try to focus more on Mexican, Latin American or Spanish authors, either, and there we mix it a bit, non-fiction and fiction. We some history books, essays, but we do believe that when a book is translated into Spanish, an American book is translated into Spanish, it generally comes, and it has gotten reviews in the New York Times and sometimes in the New Yorker and a bunch of other places. And so we don't, because in Mexico there aren't many magazines and newspapers that actually publish book reviews, and we are one of the happy few that still do. So we try to if we feel that the author doesn't need that review anymore, because there has been a lot written about that particular author, so we don't write about it. And that's the case with many of the American authors and the foreign authors that tend to be translated, unless they're a big phenomenon, like I said, like Ferrante. Of course, we've reviewed Ferrante, and we reviewed Nausgaard, and we reviewed Piketty, actually right before he was translated and published into Spanish, because of course that book was huge. So I don't know. Does that? Yeah.
So Bongani, you spoke a little bit about that already. So what about Florent and Pamela? How do you choose the books that you want to review?
It's very difficult because you must choose between interesting books. So we try to have a collective decision, collective choice on what books are returned to be reviewed. So it largely depends on the author of the books, of the subject of the books, its content, and sometimes it depends on the media impact, if there is one, of the books. We usually prefer to review books which are not well known by the public. But, a big success is very interesting because it could have social reasons or political ones. So, in this case, we choose to review these books even if we already know it. Okay.
Could you give an example of one unknown book and then one very well-known book that you've chosen to review, and why?
Very well-known books. Thomas Piketty, of course. I
think I'm going to have to ban.
Yes, but it's very interesting.
Yeah,
it's very interesting because Thomas Piketty is a friend of the family. Okay, and we usually never speak about friends. It's a deontological code. It's very important. But everyone in the world was speaking about Thomas Piketty. So we decided to speak about our friend and but to speak differently of him, to analyze, and it was with public books.
Yes, it was.
Yes, to analyze the reason of his success. And it was very interesting. Not to speak about the content of the book, because everyone knows what was in the books, but to explain why this book has his success.
And what about an unknown book?
For example, a book from a French historian about football. Soccer, yes, soccer in English, sorry. About soccer and the history of soccer in the north of France, because soccer was linked to social background in the north of France among workers, and it was published in university press, and it was very, very interesting. But La Vie des Idées was the only place where you can find a review of this book.
But you said that's because, in part, as academics, you have a view of the scene that
La Vie des Idées tries to offer to provide information from the academic fields and to a large public. It's very important for us. So we must talk about books written by scholars, by academics, scientific, and these books are not known by in the media sphere, And that's why, that's the role we play in France.
And Pamela, you have a different viewpoint.
Well, we have two different processes at the Times. We have our staff critics, the chief critic, Michiko Kakutani, Dwight Garner, and Jennifer Senior, our newest critic, and they have their process, and the New York Times Book Review has its process, and they're very different. The critics, they start with it's the critic who decides. They choose in a pecking order which books they want to review, and that, I think, they determine along similar criteria to the editors of the book review, which is, one, is this book important, of interest, relevance to New York Times readers? And then secondly, it's a matter of taste, of individual taste. And, when Dwight Garner picks a book, it might not be the most well-known, well-hyped book, but it reflects his particular taste, and the understanding is, or the idea is, that people are interested in his taste and following his trajectory. At the book review, we work from the book. So we get in, thousands of books every year. We review about 1% of the books that are published every year in print. We don't review ebooks only. We don't review self-published books. So if you take those into consideration, it's an even bleaker statistic. And we go through those books and we triage, and it's a process of elimination. But ultimately, again, it reflects those two major criteria. Is this something that we think New York Times readers will want a critic to weigh in on? Is it a book that they want to know about? Is it relevant to them? And then, of course, our critics, our editors, rather, at the book review, some have been there for 3 decades, and they have their own taste. And so their choices will reflect that taste. And I would say that, in terms of international literature, we're necessarily limited by 2 structural, issues that affect everyone, which is rights that, in general, unlike film, there isn't a world release date for a book, but they are released country by country. Sometimes, you might have a book published in Japan in 2007 and it doesn't become translated and appear here until 2015. And then, obviously, translation. And so even as we internationalize our coverage, that causes a limitation. So, for example, we recently started translating a lot of our own New York Times journalism into Portuguese for readers in Brazil. I had a review of the new Juan Gabriel Vasquez novel, and I thought, well, this might be of interest to Brazilian readers. It's obviously, he's Colombian and it's Brazil, but it's Latin American literature. He's a major figure. It's an interesting book. But when it came to make that decision about whether to translate, we chose not to because the book wasn't published in Brazil yet, and it wasn't available in Portuguese. And so, of what relevance is that necessarily to Brazilian readers when they can't actually get the book in their country and read it in their language?
Mm-hmm. So just a follow-up question. You're describing relevance in terms of availability in that sense, but you used the word kind of more broadly before. Yeah. So what makes a book relevant to readers in your mind as the editor?
Well, again, some of it, like some great literature, doesn't have to be relevant to my life at all. I frankly, personally, often like to read about something that has zero relevance to my life, to be transported somewhere else. But when we think about New York Times readers, first of all, even though I like to think of us as a literary publication within the New York Times, it's a newspaper. And so we are writing about issues of the day that we think are of cultural importance and that matter to people's lives. And so when we're looking at the kind of books, both in fiction and nonfiction, we're looking for works that we think matter in some way, that speak to our times. And again, that's not total. There are certainly books that we just think are extraordinarily well written and beautiful and deserve to get notice and therefore should be relevant. But it does provide a kind of broad guidance to our coverage. Mm-hmm.
And so as editors, what obligations do you feel to cover the literature of your own country versus the literature that's coming from a broader republic of letters? Bongani, why don't we start with you?
Like I said before, the main priority for us, we publish in English, But that's not to say, I think, but we also work from the assumption that we're at a point in time where English, French, Portuguese can also have to be regarded as African languages as well. Because even the way that the books themselves are written is also, like No Violet Bulawayo's, we need new names, that example comes up instantly for me. So in terms of our main obligation, really, like I had said before, is to cover the books which you think formally, stylistically are interesting, and also, to borrow a word that you use, relevant, that are published by publishers on the continent, that come from writers who are based in the continent. Or that's our main priority, really, just to do that.
And so maybe the reverse question is more important for you in a way. At what point would you choose to include a book that was published from beyond the continent?
We almost never do, actually. We almost never do, because how the market works is that the books that are published in New York or published in London will almost always get reviewed in the Guardian or the New York Times. They'll get quite a lot of major press. So in a sense, I think there's a duty to kind of put the spotlight on lesser known books that are equally innovative, interesting, relevant as well.
Daniel?
I think that what Pamela was saying is crucial. Availability is, in my case at least, it is the name of the game. And the fact that 70% of our readers are in Mexico, if the book is not published in Mexico, then it's difficult to find a reason to review it. Or if it's the same case, the same thing happens with the Spanish edition of the magazine. If it's not published in Spain, they won't review it. I think it's different with film because we have a film critic, and she goes to the Toronto Film Festival and she writes about movies that won't be available even for the American audiences a few months. But I think that in films you have different ways of getting movies that are not available on the big screen. You have, I don't want to mention this, I don't want to promote piracy or anything, but but with books is a whole different thing. And I think there's a statistic in Mexico which is very depressing, that if a person goes to a library and asks for a book, and for some reason that library doesn't have that book, then they won't come to look for that book again. They just go once. And again, it's really crazy, but it's true. And people in Mexico still don't, they feel somehow afraid of doing internet transactions. So we can't depend on them reading the review and saying, you know what, I'm going to Amazon and I'm going to buy that book and I'm going to read it. So it has to be published and available in Mexican libraries, and that's one of the first things that we gotta take into consideration whenever we're reviewing a book for the Mexican edition of the magazine.
So in your in Letras Libres, the book's availability is really important because there's a presumption that the audience is going to move from the review to the
or
book
sometimes they're going to move away from the book. We don't know.
But I think there are other ways to cover those books that, without doing a straight review for, an audience that doesn't necessarily have access to the books. I mean, there was a time where the Times had its TV critic going to other countries. It went to Russia and reported on what Russians were watching on TV. And I think we've all had that experience when traveling or living abroad, where you turn on the TV or you go into a local bookstore in Paris and wonder, why are they reading all these Icelandic authors I haven't heard about? And there's a way to report on that as a kind of insight into what's going on culturally in another culture. That's kind of like a letter from Paris, where you report on what they're reading and what's resonating there. That I think is just another way of covering literary culture, but not through a straight review, where it's I think.
Or I think, I'm sorry to interrupt, Pamela. Or you can tackle it as a sort of pop culture phenomenon. I remember that we didn't write a straight up review of this, but a book, we heard about a book that came out that chronicled the fact, again, this is true, that Kim Jong-il was mad about starting a North Korean film industry, and the first film that he wanted to do was a copy of Godzilla, so a North Korean version of Godzilla, and we thought, that's crazy, we gotta write about that. And this is a book that was written about this, but this hadn't been translated in Spanish, but we thought we wanna write about this. So we had the copy in English, and we wrote about, not only about what I just said, but also about Godzilla and kaijus and everything. So I think there are different ways of tackling. If you really want to talk about something in particular, there are different ways of tackling without it having to be straight up book review.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think that what both of you are pointing to is a division between a review as a form and a kind of broader cultural approach, which in your magazines might go by reporting, and which in public books might be understood as a kind of broader essay, right? Something that starts from the book and goes outward. But Florent, you must also think about this a lot, since many of the books that you're covering aren't going to be necessarily widely available because they're coming from smaller presses or academic presses.
Yes, it's difficult to answer. Well, 80% of our readers are in France. So, of course, these readers expect from us that we speak about the books published in France. But we think this is not enough. And it's very important for us to choose, to speak about books published abroad. But, well, but there is a difficulty here. What books? Which books we are going to choose? So it depends on the information we have. And we think that, the ideal will be to have in each country a sort of correspondent who is able to tell us the books which must be reviewed. So we would like to make a sort of a net of correspondent, you know, but it's very, very difficult. It's difficult in Europe. It's difficult to know, for example, in Spain, what are the important books. It's difficult to know in Germany, and it's easier, and it's a paradox, but it's easier in United States. It's easier to know which books are interesting because we have some relay in universities, in the academic fields. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. Right, so we're relying very heavily on your networks to kind of translate what's happening in other areas for you. So taking a slightly different tack, is it important for you to distinguish between serious culture and popular culture in your reviews? Do you take that division seriously, or how do you think about that as editors?
I mean, I think sometimes the most interesting writing is the match, between someone taking a very serious look at something, like Danielle Steele. I mean, there's some great examples of that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head, or to take a lighthearted approach sometimes to a very serious work, and that in those mixes sometimes you have the most interesting, entertaining, and insightful kind of writing. But I don't think in general that I don't think there's any use to anyone in taking a so-called like commercial book and not taking it seriously and poking fun of it and using it as a platform or a way to make some point and denigrate it, because what does that tell us? That it's not respectful. And so in general, we try to cover the high, low, and also the middle, because that's where a lot of readership is, and to, in general, take it, for the most part, seriously. Mm-hmm.
Well, a follow-up question to that then, when do you think that it's appropriate to publish a negative review?
It's always appropriate to publish a negative review. But I say that I say that with the two caveats. One is that I think one thing that generally distinguishes our coverage of books from the approach taken often in the UK is that in the UK, they'll be like, ooh, have I got a match? This person's going to tear that book apart, and they deliberately will set up. Often, someone will review the book of someone they used to be sleeping with and are now sleeping with that person's sister. And then, review it and take it down. And so we do make a pretty assiduous attempt at the Times to avoid conflicts of interest and try to suss them out. We don't always succeed in that, but we make a real effort to do that because otherwise, you can disagree with a review, but you shouldn't have to distrust it. And the other reason why, a couple more reasons why we do negative reviews. One is because our obligation ultimately is to our readers. It's not to the publishing industry and it's not to authors, not that we don't like all of those people and support them in their efforts, but ultimately, the number of readers is much greater than that one author. And everyone is making decisions about how to spend their time and money when they're reading a book. And so we try to respect that. Having gotten one of the nastiest, most negative reviews of one of my own books in the New York Times, I am also sympathetic to the target of those kind of reviews. And certainly in my own reviewing, which I don't do anymore as the editor now, but when I did, I would always take care to, first of all, remember in the back of my mind that writing a book is a huge deal for some people. Some people, they only write one book. They have one book in them. It's their book. It's their life. This is their achievement, their goal. And I think you have to take that, you have to respect that. And so I don't think that a negative review should be done cavalierly. And I also always would take the time to write about what a writer did well as what they didn't do well. And then finally, because the New York Times is a journalistic enterprise, we don't change people's judgment. At the book review, we are assigning books to reviewers and trusting them with that task. And if they come back with a negative assessment of a book, even if it's a book that we, who assigned it, loved, we're not going to change that. That would be journalistically unethical. So we might point out, something might be factually inaccurate, and we try to make sure that it's overall fair. But, there have been instances in which William Vollmann tore apart Anthony Doerr's All the Light We Cannot See. Just hated that book in the pages of the book review. And we have sort of one way to internally retaliate or to sort of reverse that, which is we have something called Editor's Choice, which comes out a week later. And that Editor's Choice, one of its purposes is to say, we're sorry, we liked it. We name it an Editor's Choice, which we did do with the Anthony Doerr, and then it went on to become one of the 100 Notables, and then to become one of our 10 best books, and in any case has been on the bestseller list for 2 years, so I think he pretty much couldn't care less what William Vollmann thinks.
Yeah, sweet revenge. Serious and popular culture.
Serious and popular culture, yes. The distinction is important for us because we have chosen not to speak about popular culture because we prefer to speak about academic fields, books from academic fields. And because, for example, we never review books from journalists or from essayists, or from politicians, which are very popular in France. Yes, very popular.
Especially when they're about people's sex lives. And you have like these are all
yes,
letters.
Of course, yes. Yes. I don't mean that these books are not interesting. Of course, they could be interesting. But I think media speak largely of these books, but never speak about the books from historic fields, from social sciences, for example. So the distinction is very important for us.
I'm actually holding a copy of our latest, which is a football issue, looks at football, which is soccer here, right? Yeah. And I don't think there's anything more popular than soccer in the entire world. So That's the answer about popular and serious literature. And also just to pull in one more plug, the book, it's available at the entrance there for $5 if you have change. Cool.
I don't know if the rest of the editorial team would agree with me, but I've always believed that there are no frivolous subject matters, but frivolous angles in which you tackle those subject matters. And so I've tried, sometimes unsuccessfully, to write about what people might consider popular culture and try to do it in an interesting or novel way. Sometimes we fail spectacularly, sometimes we sort of do it right. But the problem sometimes has to do with our audience, with our public. I remember that when the last Harry Potter book was about to be published, one of our staff writers wrote something about why he believed that J.K. Rowling had a moral obligation to kill Harry Potter in the last book. And why he had to die. Let's be honest, there was no way that he. And we got flooded with letters from our readers saying, why are you reviewing this crap? You should be reviewing Álvaro Enríquez's book, you know what I mean? Instead of, or something, Juan Gabriel Vázquez. Instead of, why are you writing about J.K. Rowling? Even if you're doing it, like I said, from a different angle. I'm not saying that was the right angle. I'm saying we try to find an angle to make the book seem less pop and maybe more palatable for our readership. And at least I try to do so. I don't know if we get it right. I don't like that distinction that much between. I know there is a difference between serious, quote unquote, serious culture and popular culture, but I try to bring it together, bring both of them together in the magazine as much as I can. All right.
So does Harry Potter die in the end? I haven't.
I won't say, but many people haven't read it. He doesn't.
Yes. Well, speaking of bringing things together, we are out of time. But thank you very much for coming to speak to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we're done.
I want to thank our panelists, and we're going to start the next panel again in 5 minutes, so feel free to stretch your legs, but don't wander too far. So if you are on the second panel, actually, if you don't mind, you sit there and then do that. Okay, grab your cookies and get back in your seats, please. We are going to begin our second panel. Okay. Oh my God, is all our water going?
Yeah, not a bad idea.
Yes.
No, I'm good. Okay, thanks. We're going to start. Wow, this is like being a moderator at one of the first two debates. Okay, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to try to do so in the order in which they are sitting. So across from me, we have Timothy Small, who lives in Milan, Italy, where he edited Vice Italy, or Vice Italia, or perhaps Vice Italia, for 8 years. But now he runs Alkemy Content, devoted to finding experimental solutions to the changing media landscape. He's also founded L'Ultimo Uomo, a long-form sports magazine. So if La Vie des Idées is looking for an Italian sports correspondent, I think you found him. Prismo, a contemporary culture magazine that deals with philosophy, post-humanism, literature, video games, and semiotics, with one long-form article per day. The Towner with Moleskine, which paper fetishists everywhere will be happy to hear about. And he has also written for too many amazing international publications to mention, and we're very happy to welcome him here today. Next we have Laura Bennett, who is a Slate senior editor focused on culture coverage, and she edits the Slate Book Review, among other things. Previously, she was the culture editor at Salon, and before that, staff writer and assistant literary editor at The New Republic. She's written for publications including New York Magazine, The New York Times, and Bloomberg Business Week. Anjum Hasan is the author of several novels, including most recently The Cosmopolitans, also Neti Neti, and Lunatic in My Head, and the short story collection Difficult Pleasures. She is books editor at The Caravan, which is India's leading magazine of long-form reporting and essays, and I'm also proud to say a public books partner. We exchange 1 or 2 articles per month. They publish a piece of ours, we publish a piece of theirs. And finally, our keynote speaker is also joining very generously our panel, and this is James Wood, who's professor of practice of literary criticism at Harvard University and a staff writer for The New Yorker. I suspect many people here probably have you in their book bags right now. He has also been the chief literary critic of The Guardian, a Booker Prize judge, the senior editor at The New Republic, and a contributor to the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, and the London Review of Books. So we will be asking some of the same questions we asked the previous panelists, but I actually wanted to start with some more autobiographical questions. Can you remember the first book that you ever published a review of? Or what is the first book you remember reviewing in print? I'll go first. I have no idea why this was the first book that I reviewed, but for a Baltimore Free newspaper when I was in graduate school, I somehow got suckered into reviewing Zsa Zsa Gabor's autobiography, which was better than I thought it would be.
Well, actually, my first article ever was a review, but it wasn't a book review, it was a video game review, and it was 50 Cent's video game, which was a very bad video game.
I think the first review I ever wrote before I was an editor, I had to adjust this, it was far too tall for me when I first sat down, I was working at the New Republic, I was an assistant editor there, and I was dispatched to review a book about Scandal by Laura Kipnis. And I remember there was an extended riff on Tiger Woods' infidelities, and I was really excited to sink my teeth into that book.
I think one of the first books that I reviewed, which was almost like a kind of an anti-review, it was around the time Vikram Seth's The Suitable Boy came out, and there was all this hype and hysteria, and I wrote this piece saying, actually, I don't think that's the book that everyone should be talking about. They should be talking about a previous book of his, which was this slight, fairly unknown at that time, travel book, where he travels overland from China to Tibet to India. And it has little bits of poetry in the middle, and I thought it was a beautiful little book that kind of disappeared in all the noise around Suitable Boy. And then, being the age I was, which was, I think, late teens, I thought I must send the writer a copy. Because how will he know that I have made this point about his book? And I did send it to him, and he did write back saying, that was a very strange review, but never mind, thank you very much. So that's how I started.
Your review was much more productive and noble than mine. I know that the first review I wrote for The Guardian was something I'm ashamed of, and try to remember as often as I can as a self-correction, because it was a review of a first novel. I thought the first novel was no good. I was very young and eager to prove myself with rhetorical, sword fighting and so on, performance. The novel was called When the Monster Dies, and I began the review, Lord, if it only would. Which is, okay, fine, you're 21 and you think, I need to make a splash. And what seemed to me at that moment important was my career, not the novelist's. But a year or two later, I heard that, obviously the review had caused a lot of pain, but that the review had actually come out on the day that the author had a publication party, and that it had sort of ruined the publication party. And ever since, I have made a vow not to be cruel about first novels.
Sorry, I'm going to take a moment to give our panelists.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I scored one.
Well, actually, all of those responses, but especially yours, James, brings me to the next question I want to ask, which is when you edit a review or write a review or either, who are you thinking of as the audience? Are you thinking of it as you as a critic trying best to understand your own response and give that the highest expression possible? Are you thinking of the author? Are you thinking of the potential readers of the book? How do you imagine your audience, either, again, for something that you are editing, for something you are yourself writing, or both if you wear both hats? And I suppose, sorry, we can also bring the global-local dimension in here, which is, do you, when you're writing, when you are thinking of references and what someone will and won't get, at public books, we're often thinking about, well, will someone understand this Latin phrase, or can you just say Heidegger, or do you need to actually say, not just who Heidegger is, but what you mean by Heidegger? But there's also a national dimension to that. Like, can we assume that everybody knows that everybody knows, for example, what a show like Orange is the New Black is? Does it have an international audience? So those are some other things to think about in asking how you conceive of audience.
I used to think that, I used to think of reviewing as a sort of agonistic activity in which I was really interested in your thing about sending the book to Vikram Seth, but the review to Vikram Seth, because I envisaged my reviews as either quarrels with or celebrations of, but always in some ways letters to writers. That was, and somehow I'd convinced myself that, I guess I still believe this to some extent, that looking at the tradition of literary criticism, particularly of literary criticism rather than just academic literary criticism, that this was somehow part of the tradition, that it was about, sort of Coleridge coming along and saying, look, here's where Wordsworth is great and here's where Wordsworth isn't so great, and that kind of thing. And growing up a little, wisdom has taught me increasingly that a review really is ideally over the head of the author, that it's for the reader, not the author anymore. And I suppose I do think particularly since moving from a smaller magazine, the New Republic, to the New Yorker, I do think about readership, about having a larger readership, and how, Laura will know well that small magazines like the New Republic are often, they get their sustenance from a certain sort of militancy. That's how they understand themselves. The smallness is the smallness which has to be defended in some way and has a sort of purity about it. What happens when you're writing for, in my case now, a magazine with a much larger general readership? Does that mean then that some modification happens to one's own reviewing? I think in my case it has meant that, and I'm less interested in fighting critical battles and more interested in discovering writers, partly for my own pleasure, but also for the pleasure and edification of an audience who presumably don't know they exist either.
I think very much when I'm both writing and editing, I'm thinking more of the reader and the readership than trying to directly address the author. And I think apart from the reader, I'm also responding in some way to the Indian literary culture in English. And I think when I started putting together the Caravan books pages 7 years ago, the landscape of reviewing was sort of divided between two kinds of things. One, I think, is the kind of review where the personality of the reviewer is predominant. And so the review becomes, I think in the worst sense, an expression of personality, where you've identified a particular tone of voice in which you review, and then it's often a set of opinions, not necessarily an argument, not necessarily a response to the terms of the book or the inner life of the book, but a way of getting across your style and your personality and putting your stamp on that book. And sort of the review space tends to be dominated by that kind of writer. On the other hand, you have sort of literary journalism in the most puerile sense, which is sort of a summarization of the book, and that's it. You don't really need an argument. So I was responding to both of those things and trying to see what are the good things I can take from these two fairly limited ways of writing about books. So the good thing that I wanted to take from the literary journalism was, yes, we do need to explain what's going on. We can't assume that everyone knows everything. And from the more personality-driven, yes, we do need good stylists. We need good writers. But that does not mean that it's enough that the byline is not going to be everything. You still need to use those 2,000 words or 3,000 words to make an argument. So I think all these things put together means that I'm responding very much to what can we use the space to say about the book that will interest the reader, and not what is the writer going to feel. And I think ever since then I've tried to stick to that, to develop an argument, to sort of also talk about the context and not just limit it to that one book. And it's very rare actually that we're reviewing a book. We're usually reviewing a bunch of books on a related theme, or we're reviewing the collected works or a bunch of books by the same writer. So yeah.
I think that is a very interesting question. And as I reflect back on the beginnings of, when I was first learning to be a critic, I feel like I was schooled in the art of the sort of elegant and clever evisceration. Like there was a very high premium placed on the nimble and funny takedown. And that was something that I valued a lot as a young writer. I liked to read it, and I liked to, I dabbled in writing it occasionally, but I think I sort of willfully blinded myself to the author as a figure in my earliest conceptions to criticism. I sort of detached him or her from the page and was like, it's the text, and within that space, it's easy to justify a lot of sort of critical misbehavior. But I think now it's the reader who I'm imagining when I'm writing, but it's not an abstract reader. It's almost like a reader profile that I've conjured to help me assign and edit or, write the work that I'm most proud of. So it's kind of the Slate reader that we consider sort of institutionally is a similar figure. It's like my smartest and funniest and most generous of spirit friend. It's the person who's most inclined to, read the best intentions or sort of the intentions that I want them to read in a work of criticism. And that's like a fictional figure in a lot of ways, but I try to imagine that person reading what I assign and what I write.
Yeah, I think for me it depends very much on what hat I'm wearing. As you were saying before in your question, it depends really on what hat I'm wearing and in what way am I approaching that review. So, I publish and I sometimes edit a few, like 6 magazines. So it really depends on that magazine. And
you have even more jobs than I do.
Yeah, so it depends really. That magazine has a reader, has a specific reader. That magazine has a tone of voice. It has some, editorial conventions. It has some rules. They might be length or tone. Or in one magazine, we might not do something by rule. So I think that depends a lot. When I write for other magazines, I tend to try and not ever write a negative review. I'd rather just not write about the book if it's bad. Because it's just attention anyway, especially today with the internet. So it's just clicks you're giving essentially to something that you think is bad. And I'm talking especially not necessarily about bad books by struggling writers, but by celebrity books or politicians or liars. Now, in the case of Italy, there's not many people who buy books, so I think it's very important that we put forward like a really positive celebration. So what we do, for example, the last magazine we founded, 1 month old, we have a book review section. We publish 3 book reviews per week, sometimes 4 or 5. And we only write books about books that we think are interesting and are worthwhile to buy. It's basically we're trying to get people to buy more books, I guess. But then it depends, it depends on the voice of the different magazines. So recently an Italian soccer player wrote an autobiography. He's 23 years old, and he wrote an autobiography. And there was a big scandal because he said that he didn't like the supporters of his teams because they did something bad one time, and he was going to send these Argentinians to their house and beat them up. And this created a huge scandal. So we assigned a guy who's a postgrad student in Russian studies to review his autobiography. And that's obviously going to be like a funny review because it's going to be extremely literary of a really bad book. So I guess it really depends on the context also of the single magazine in which that review appears.
Let me ask you about how you think of the works you review, the places where you publish, and again, you've all spoken, I think, mostly of thinking about the reader to whom you're writing, for whom you're writing. So how local is when you imagine your readership, not your actual readers, but the reader in your head? Do they share a zip code with you? Do they share a borough with you, if we're being New York-centric? Do they live in your city? Do they live in your country? Or do you think of them as potentially located anywhere? And or if you're trying to do all of the above, how do you navigate between those?
Well, okay, in Italy, there's not many, it's one of those countries where we don't really have like one city that's the center of culture as much as other countries. It's not like Paris or New York. So for example, the publishing industry in Italy is divided pretty much equally between Rome, Turin, and Milan. So we definitely don't think about a city person, we don't, or even a neighborhood person. We are aware of the fact that certain writers or books might be more interesting in different parts of the country, and we're also aware of different reviewers might have more readers in different parts of the country, and so sometimes we try and match those to create something interesting. Maybe we have one of our writers is in Naples, maybe he'd be more interesting to review the Elena Ferrante novels than me, who was born in Milan. So we try and obviously think about geography and about also culture, because Italy is a place where different geographies have very, very different cultures, but we don't certainly limit ourselves to a city ever. We are limited obviously by language, so we try and stick within Italian borders, even the parts of Switzerland where they speak Italian, that's fine too. Wherever people speak Italian for us is fine.
Slate is not the paper of record. Sort of institutionally, we are I mean, it's just we're more sideways, we're more askance. We are, by design, a little bit, we're not covering everything. We're cherry picking what to cover and covering it in a very specific way. And and to be quite honest, our readership is resolutely English speaking. Like, it's a very national audience. And we even, I'm sort of ashamed to admit this in this company, but we experimented at one point with an international paywall because advertisers don't want foreign audiences because they don't buy their products. And so we briefly put up a paywall, and we got rid of it both because of sort of queasiness at the idea of erecting obstacles to international audiences, and also because it wasn't generating revenue. But as much as that sucks, I find it interesting as evidence of like the very real struggles that we face as editors in building a book review that is truly international. It's hard. Practically, it's really hard. The books I assign, I tend to think of the book review as a glimpse into the English-speaking publishing world, and that to the extent that foreign readers are interested in that, we serve them well. But we cover works in translation. But this, I think, is kind of an interesting example. We did a piece a few years ago about Juan Rulfo's Pedro Páramo, I believe it was, and the headline we gave to it to try to sort of draw in readers who might be encountering an unfamiliar work was "The Most Perfect Book You've Never Heard of." And that kind of assumption is, it's frustrating that we make assumptions like that, but that headline drew in a lot more readers than we would have otherwise. And the way we justify it internally is that, well, great, we attracted eyeballs to a book that they might not have heard of otherwise. And Slate is not, we are very interested in the mix of high and low brow, and in leveraging a very sort of serious-minded and highbrow perspective on low culture is part of our DNA, and we do that in the book review too. But even within that, we're not I used to work at the New Republic, where it's a very different place to work than the New Republic. We're not the New York Review of Books, but we're not, Vulture, which is a website that covers pop culture. We are somewhere in the middle, and it's a constant internal negotiation to make sure we don't tilt too far in one direction.
I think running a review journal or running a magazine in India in English, you cannot be local in the sense of speaking to an audience in a particular city or a particular state of the country, because English is dispersed through the country and spoken in the metropolises. So you're addressing an urban Indian metropolitan audience inevitably. But the other thing I think that you're doing when you're trying to sort of raise the bar, doing literary reviewing in a magazine, is you're also responding not just to the people who might be reading in English, and are therefore sort of dispersed through the country, because in terms of numbers, that readership is huge potentially. We're a country of more than 1 billion people, out of whom at least 10% speak English. And so the potential audience is huge, but the actual audience for a serious long-form magazine is actually very, very small. A lot of these people who speak in English may only speak it, may not be reading in it. If they are reading in it, they may read only newspapers. The sales of newspapers are very, very high in India, partly because they're very, very cheap. They're very subsidized. So the magazine space actually becomes smaller and smaller when you get down to the basics of how many people are actually reading. And in that magazine space, you have to be doing a lot of politics, and you have to be doing a lot of cricket. You have to be doing things that people are interested in. Caravan does a lot of politics. We don't do that much cricket, so it's funny that it's curious that we're still around. But within that, I have 10 pages to do literary reviewing, and that's even more marginal. That's even more marginal, to be writing about books either published in English or translated in English, in a journal that is already quite small. So the way I try to sort of argue for the relevance of it, knowing that the relevance is not there in the numbers, is to say that, can we make a contribution to the ecology of literature in this country? And the ecology of literature at the moment is that publishing has grown hugely. There are many more publishing houses now than there were even 10 years ago in English. So the market seems to have grown. If there are more publishing houses, that ought to mean there are more readers. But there isn't all the other attendant stuff that should be there if you have a growing publishing industry. You don't have the journals, you don't have the serious journals, you don't have places where you can publish fiction, short fiction or poetry or critical essays. You don't have the fellowships, you don't have the departments of literature that are also teaching writing, that are teaching enough contemporary literature. So you don't have all of that. So the way I see it is that, can we make a contribution to that space? And that readership, I think, is potentially huge because there's more and more interest in writing. Many more people want to become writers, are interested in people of their age who are getting published and getting talked about. So that's the space that one is trying to respond to.
One of the delicious things about not being an editor is that I don't have to think about this stuff too much. I used to, when I was at The Guardian for 2 or 3 years, blissful years, I and my boss, who was the literary editor, ran absurdly highbrow pages. We knew it wouldn't last. It was just a frail dream that we kept going, you know. And I remember we were called down once by the editor of the whole newspaper, and he said, he had us there in his room, and he said, "We really can't go on like this, you know, reviewing these Yale University Press books that are £50 a book. You do understand, don't you," he said, "that only 16% of the Guardian readership reads the books pages." And my boss, Richard Gott, subsequently unmasked as a KGB spy, in fact. He was sacked in 1994 from his job as literary editor of The Guardian for taking money from the Soviet Union in the 60s. Just said with tremendous aplomb back to the editor, "Yes, but they're the most important 16%. Which, of course, you have to believe to keep on generating the pages we were doing. So it's nice not to think about that stuff. I mean, of course, there is a kind of, one is always thinking about it, there is a formal history, say, to the books pages at the New Yorker. And broadly speaking, you would have to say, going back, say, to Hannah Arendt writing about Brecht and so on, and then Edmund Wilson, Hannah Arendt, then sort of George Steiner, for a long time, until I guess Tina Brown came along and said, you know, George Steiner, is he hot? No. But that tradition, which lasted, you know, from the 50s into the 80s, I guess, or early 80s, there was a spirit of noblesse oblige about it, I think, and top-down cultural education. There was an understanding that the average New Yorker reader was, as it were, making his or her harried way, you know, on the 532 or 632 from Grand Central back to wherever, Greenwich, and was going to get some European culture. That was definitely an understanding of the role of the book review, and I hope that doesn't sort of cling to what I do, because ideally, I think, I hope this doesn't sound too narcissistic, I would be just trying to. I think I would be just trying to please myself. That's to say, insofar as I think of a reader, I think of someone like me who would like to read what I'm writing, if that makes sense. In the way that, you know, novelists will say, you know, I write the kind of novel that ideally I would like to read, and I don't seem to find it in the shop. It's that kind of thing that keeps me going.
So I'm going to ask another autobiographical question, but invite you, if you like, to extend it into a more general consideration of how you think about national literature and quote-unquote world literature, or I think what we used to call foreign literature back when I was a child. And that is, when do you first remember thinking of a book published in your country as being specifically of that country? So instead of just, you know, reading it and kind of taking for granted that this was a book and you were reading it, having a sense of this is an American book, an Italian book, an Indian book, an English book, since I'm assuming this would have happened kind of early on. And also, when do you first remember reading a book that was originally published in another country, in another language, and being very taken with its foreignness, its otherness, so, how important, I guess another way of phrasing this is, how important is the national origin of a book for you, and how did you acquire, if it is or if it isn't, how did you acquire or lose that awareness of national origin as something that matters in literature? And I ask that in part because at a conference on the Global Book Review, it's hard to know if what we're aiming for is giving people more awareness of many national literatures or encouraging people to transcend considerations of national origin in literature.
Should I go?
Yeah, why?
Italy is a strange country in that sense. We don't have that many. We have a large percentage of translated books, very large, larger than most would think. The vast majority of editorial cases, the big book of the year is not from an Italian author, and that pattern tends to be more and more similar to the international pattern. The big book of the year is the big book of the year, kind of worldwide, so that's kind of, I guess, global. And personally, when I approach this, I try and make sure that when we publish something, there is like the right percentage of Italian culture represented in there. I think it's very important. I think in a way to kind of maintain that garden, draw attention to those writers, those publishing houses that tend to be smaller Italian independent publishing houses. Personally speaking, when I was a kid, I remember the first time I read a book and I thought, this is for me. This is talking to me personally. It was an Italian, like a book that was very big for Italian teenage readers in the 90s, which talked about a teenager who fell in love and did some drugs, and he was driving his Vespa around in a punk band, and those are all things that were kind of...
What was it called?
It was called Jack Frusciante è uscito dal gruppo. It's not a great novel, but it was very generational, and that was the first time when I felt I was reading something that was about my country, about me, about my people, about my friends, about what we were going through as a generation and as a culture. On the other hand, in the same period of time, I read Less Than Zero. I think I was 14, and that just blew my mind completely. I thought it was the coolest thing that ever happened. I think I wrote Disappear here on my backpack, thinking I was super cool. I was such a nerd. But still, and that to me was very interesting. That opened up a whole world to me about, I think, a lot of music and culture that I was consuming at that time. So I think for me, it has a lot to do with my teenage formative years, I guess.
In college, I studied Spanish and Latin American literature. And in that sphere, you're so perpetually, pelted with context because everything is socio-political, and the Latin American boom is so inextricably tied to its context. And that, I feel like, I grew up reading those novels and feeling like understanding where they were from was key to understanding the books themselves. But for some reason, the books I read in English, this is going to seem like a pretty late self-reckoning, but I would say the first real moment when I thought about how much books could feel like a product of their, their hyper-local provenance was around the time when like Nathaniel P. and HBO's Girls were all in the atmosphere. So I was like the culture editor at that point. And it took that long for me to say, well, to realize how sort of blinkered a book could be and how sort of rooted in its context, and how that could be both interesting and both worth pushing past. So I don't know if that's the real answer about when I first confronted it, but that's sort of in my more sort of meta incarnation as a person who thinks about how to cover culture. That was a real moment, and that was just a few years ago, like 2012, I think, was when it sort of started, was when I sort of started thinking about that even more intensely.
I think that question is very loaded in the case of someone like me who grew up reading almost exclusively in English. And if you're growing up reading almost exclusively in English in the 80s, you are only reading Enid Blyton. late 70s, you're only reading Enid Blyton, and then you're reading Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys, and Alfred Hitchcock, Three Investigators. So for a certain generation of Indian readers and writers, there has inevitably been a process by which we've had to turn back or turn towards Indian writers and say, hey, these are voices that we can identify with. It did not happen naturally. A child today can read Indian literature written by Indians, published in India, but that was not happening 20, 30 years ago. And I think for me, the sort of formative decade was the 90s, because that was the decade when Indian English literature just boomed. There were all these novels, many were autobiographical, and I don't think that's a coincidence, because they were about saying that this is my life and it's worthy as a subject of literature. And it was the same with Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things, a wonderful novel which I would consider sort of foundational to my own discovery of the literature, novel by Upmanyu Chatterjee called English, August. And both of them are nicknames for this character. He's called English because he speaks English in an environment where not many people do. And August is one of his names as well. So all these novels which sort of brought English, I think, into the mainstream as an Indian literary language. And I think it's connected to what I'm trying to do in Caravan as well, because I think those writers that became very successful in the 90s then went on to either not write more books or write more books but of a very different kind. But I think they opened the doors to the succeeding generation. So now in the review space, you have people like that being reviewed. So there's no problem there. Where I see a problem or a lack is that there are also the older Indian writers, the sort of modernists of the early to mid 20th century. And those are writers who are sort of enshrined because they're important with a capital I, but they're not necessarily read. You know, and to someone like me who's asking myself, okay, the writers of the 90s were interesting, but where did they come out of? Did they just come out of nowhere, or was there something already in the culture that enabled them? And so last couple of years in Caravan, I've just been trying to commission these essays looking at these older writers and asking, fine, they won the awards, they've been translated, the National Academy of Letters, the Sahitya Academy, has all their works, but is it possible to make them readable? And I'm trying to do it by getting younger writers to write about them and to ask, are they maybe they're just boring, in which case it's fine, but can we re-examine them and see how they sound in this day and age?
It's interesting you mentioned the massive boom in Indian writing in English, because I think, well, I have a very distinct memory of when Rushdie won the Booker Prize for Midnight's Children. I was probably about 15, I think. And it did seem as if the novel had come from nowhere. That was the first thing. Like, what was this? Secondly, I think even at 15, I understood something's changed. This seems like a world event. This could be a sort of global novel in some way. And it was partly because there was more fuss made about that winner of the prize than had ever been made before. Also because the prize itself had been televised for the first time. So it was suddenly a massive media experience, and you'd walk into the bookshop and there was this huge dump bin with Midnight's Children. I don't know when I first became aware of reading a foreign book, but yes, the Rushdie made a major impact. I guess in terms of feeling that I was reading something English, which I could identify as English, that's to say, being a little bit alienated from my own tradition, was probably discovering George Orwell in my teens, because of course he's obviously so English, but he writes about Englishness and England, I was growing up in the north of England. This was during Mrs. Thatcher's time when there was a lot of industrial unrest. The coal mines up in Durham, where I lived, were on strike, and Orwell, Orwell's writing about socialism and labor, and particularly mining, actually, really made me just alive to the historical moment, even though I was reading someone who died, 30 or 40 years before.
Thank you. I could go on talking to you guys for another hour, but what we're going to do now is ask the previous panelists who were able to stay to come to the stage. I am going to vacate this chair, and we're going to bring 2 chairs onto the stage, and we're now going to open things up to questions from the audience. But please join me first in thanking these panelists. One second, I will call on someone to...
That's all right.
Oh, not sure.
Move the table.
Did you write about Rushdie later when you were
Good idea.
Was that when you with the
Well, I could just act as moderator, since I feel I don't know. Okay, so there's a moderator. What is there such a thing as a global review? And do we really want to? Would that be a good thing? Wouldn't it be like what the Brexiteers supposedly accuse the EU of being, sort of a supranational? What would a global review be as such?
Meaning something that appeals to a global audience.
Yeah.
I don't know, I was just...
One other question that I would also throw out that's
Yeah.
not useful, but in the spirit of that is there some publication that you all feel comes closest to accomplishing that exists in the world right now? Like, do we have a version of a global review? Is there something you look to as a model?
Well, I would ask you, each of you, how do you find out about literature published outside your country and in a language other than the one that you read? Especially, how do you find out about literature published outside your country that has not been translated into your language? Do you find out about it?
Individually, not about the magazine itself, because in the case of the magazine, we have a lot of... We employ different reviewers, and sometimes they propose certain reviews. And so they might bring a book to the table, and we read it, and we decide whether or not we want to write about it. In my case in particular, to be honest, it's a shame that she left, but the New York Times book review is actually something that I read a lot. I feel that it gives you a big, sort of a wide perspective of what's being published in the United States, which is, I regret to say this, there aren't any Mexicans around here, but I do read much more in American literature or literature in English. When you said Less Than Zero, that just clicked, because that's one of the first books, not in Spanish, that I read and that I fell in love with. And I am not proud to say this, but I still read a lot more in English than in Spanish, and we don't get sort of a review of that in Spanish of the things that are published in English. We don't get that in Mexico, so at least I have to keep an eye out for something like the New York Times book review, and just get a sense of what's being published in the United States.
I'm just wondering, I mean, the perspective from India, if you're trying to grapple with this idea of the global, it seems to be Anglo-American. It seems to be the same thing as Anglo-American, because if I am to find out as a reader in English what's being published from China, or what's being published from Latin America, or what's being published from the Middle East, the only access I have is through the Anglo-American publishing industry, because the rest of us are not doing the work of translating each other's or finding other ways to access each other's literatures. A couple of years ago, I was trying to do a piece on contemporary Chinese literature, because I was like, they're next door. And there's more and more interest from the economic point of view about China and India, and I think vice versa, and more Indians are going to China. And so somehow, for all these decades, we kind of, either we fought a war or we ignored each other, but now suddenly we realize there is this country. So I was just interested, what is the literary scene in China? So I started trying to access contemporary fiction, and I found the only books that I could access were published by either niche publishers, mostly in America or the UK. And so when I spoke to a few Indian editors and said, why don't we translate from these countries, they said, we don't have the resources to do it. So global to me is, can be a very, very anodyne way sometimes of looking at the world, because sometimes I think there was an older paradigm of exchange, and the word used, I think, there was international. And earlier this year, I carried an essay on a magazine called Lotus that was started in the late, you would know about it, that was started in the late 1950s. And it came out of this sort of Afro-Asian solidarity movement, a sort of third world movement during the Cold War. And the idea was that we have something in common in the third world, and there were these large literary conferences, and this magazine came out of there. And that was an interesting example, because there was a genuine attempt to bring literature from all these cultures together in one magazine. To me, that doesn't seem the same thing as publishing an article in Caravan and hoping it will be read by anyone sitting anywhere. So international seems to be something that you invest with meaning by actually doing, making certain, interventions, whereas global just means, I don't know, it's sort of an empty democratization, which I'm not sure how to give it meaning. I don't think it has meaning on its own.
Well, I'll step in, and I don't know if Kate will want to add something and speak as an editor here, that there's definitely a way in which global has just become a kind of neo-colonial filter. Everything has to get filtered through the Anglo-American, which is not the least bit global. It's just having sort of one cultural monolith that occasionally turns its attention to some other centers of production. And I think that if we think of the pre-1989 world, people in China were probably learning Russian, people in Russia were probably learning Chinese, people all over Eastern Europe were learning Russian, people were a lot more bilingual. Even in the United States, in the spirit of the Cold War, there was a lot more investment in language study, and in the sense that if only for our spies or our editors at The Guardian, people needed to know more than one language. And I think, at least from where I sit, there has been less of that. But the university remains a space where people are polylingual, both because they come from all over and because we continue in the humanities to have requirements for language study. And so one of the things it's been remarkably challenging at public books to move beyond what's published in the United States and England and in English. And one of the ways we found we can do this is to draw on the expertise of professors and graduate students who, if their specialty is Chinese literature or literature in Nigeria or literature in India that's not published in English, they actually know other languages. They are keeping up. It's part of their job to keep up with the literary scene in these countries. And even then it's actually, and that seems like it would be very simple, just contact professors of foreign languages and literatures and ask them to review the books they're reading, and even that turns out to be not as easy as possible. But I do think that that is a valuable thing to do because it pushes against the bland homogenizing meaning of global, which just comes down to what the 3% of books that US publishers decide on principles that I often find quite baffling to translate from other countries. And Tim wants to answer. And then.
There's just, I think, going back to your question, I think that's a very interesting one. I don't think that necessarily is needed. I think, literature amongst all the arts is probably the one that's that most deals with like subtlety and the interiorization of culture and subjective experiences that have to be shared in a way. And I don't think that it's necessarily a good idea that everything has to be interesting for everyone, because we come from different countries, we speak different languages, we have different cultures, we have different families, different political systems, everything is different. There are some books that can maybe go beyond that, but I'll just give you the case of, like, it is completely an Anglo-American thing. The Elena Ferrante novels were published in Italy and they were selling well. Only once it became an American phenomenon did the Italians go like, oh wait, she's super important. We should write more articles about Elena Ferrante. And the book hadn't changed by a comma. It's the same thing that happened with Bolaño, that in Italy was published 20 years ago by a small Italian publishing house in Palermo that does great work with Spanish. They just translate great Latin American authors, Celerio in Palermo, who's actually, the Countess is actually a character in one of the Bolaño novels. And so that then, the New York thing happens with Bolaño, the New Yorker, New York Times, Wiley Agency, Paris Review, New York Review of Books, that explodes, everyone's like, oh, it's the coolest thing. Then it goes back to Italy, and suddenly what happens is that the Bolaño is now bought by a bigger publishing house out of the original catalog. They republish all the books and everyone's writing articles about it, but it had been available. So I think it's about attention and it's about power in a way. And as long as America remains the biggest power in the world, then it will all go in a way through the English language and through English publishing, English language publishing.
Yeah, I just want to say real quick that it's strange because in Latin America, and it's not that way at all. When an author is important and that author is translated into English, nobody cares, nobody notices, nobody has mentioned that Enrique was translated in English, nobody cares that Juan Gabriel Vázquez was translated to English and had a huge success, and his review in the New York Times Book Review was great, and nobody cares and nobody notices. I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, I'm just saying that that's the way it is in Latin America, and the fact that Bolaño was a huge success in Mexico because he was against the whole, for many reasons, he's a great writer, and he was against Paz, who was considered the establishment, and he's very much loved in Mexico, and the fact that he was successful here,
Excellent.
nobody talks about that.
Is that because you have like a billion readers?
There are a lot of people lining up to ask questions. To be continued. Sorry, was there a line? Were you?
Yeah,
okay,
actually,
please.
hi. I thought I'd get on the line because I always notice if one person in the audience asks a question, then all of a sudden a line will form. So, hello. My name is Meryl Zagaric. I'm a literary publicist. I've been promoting books in translation for 17 years in my own business and for several years at Knopf Publishers before I opened my own firm. And something that I've noticed is when I started my own company 17 years ago, I began to get hired by European publishers whose books were in translation. And I had a very hard time getting the press here to pay any attention to them. They would say, well, we've got too many American authors we have to cover. We don't have any space for that. And it took quite some time to build a reputation for these publishers, and now they are being published. And I actually spoke to Pamela about it as she was leaving. And something I've noticed is that because of the internet, I think that it's opened up the world in a way that we couldn't have imagined even 17, 20 years ago in a very completely different way. But I sort of forgot my question because I was up here so long, but I think that I could go, waiting to talk, but I think that I could go back and say, for all of you here, I find from a marketer's point of view that the press is influenced if you say the book has been published or translated into 7 languages, and you list the 7 languages or the 8 languages, all of a sudden they start to think, people around the world are starting to read this book, maybe we need to review it, or maybe we need to pay attention to this author. And I wonder if this influences your decisions in deciding to assign the book for review. Maybe this goes more towards the American reviewers here and editors here. Does it make a difference to you?
It's not untempting. Yeah.
Does
yeah.
It does.
Yeah. I mean, sort of whatever it takes, really. I mean, I have a distinct memory of getting the proof copy of Knausgaard's My Struggle, the first one. And to answer the earlier question, how did I hear about it? Because the publisher, thanks to the publisher, right? It was the publisher, Archipelago, was doing the work, was doing the cultural work, and sent it to people like me. And I'd never heard of it. But the letter may have said something about it being translated into other languages, but above all, the sort of the dangling temptation thing, where the letter said something about how that fact that kept on being recycled, that something like half of the Norwegian entire population had read the book, and I thought, well, that's kind of interesting.
This is exciting to me that you read the letters that go with the books that we write. Yes. And Laura? How about Slate?
Oh, that's, for me, I wish I could say that a tagline that says it's been translated into 7 languages would be enough to sort of propel it onto my desk. But I've been trying to think about the books we've covered. Well, we have published an essay about Michel Houellebecq this past year, and it was because one of the critics I most admire, a freelancer I work with, came to me and said, frankly, I hated this book, and I feel so moved to write a piece about it. And it didn't come from a place of, I love the syndrome that Pamela described in the first panel about like vindictiveness or my, husband's ex-girlfriend, whatever. It was a reasoned and interesting argument about why the book was bad, and we covered it. And did it go gangbusters in terms of finding an audience? No, it did not, but it was a really nice piece of literary criticism. We covered Javier Marias because I like Javier Marias. There's no better reason, because he's important and we recognize that, but our readers don't read our essays about Javier Marias the way they read everything we write about Jonathan Franzen. And that is something that we grapple with daily.
Hello. I'm one of these millennial people who's been lucky enough to grow up in multiple countries and multiple languages, so I have this luxury of having access to what's going on in a lot of different countries. And I moved here quite recently, and I'm kind of grappling with this thing of convincing people that it's important. And so I've been sort of fantasizing about how you would be able to do that. And I'm wondering if you ever fantasize about stimulating a more international or a more intercultural discussion. And one of the things I wondered is if you could use the social capital, especially of a bigger publication like the New York Times Book Review or like The Guardian, to review a book which hasn't been translated, and even if you don't have the resources, to stimulate it to be translated by the people who do have the resources. Or if you had come up with, even if it's not necessarily something that will happen tomorrow, if you ever think about ideas which could stimulate that.
Who would have the resources to do that?
Yeah, I mean, it seems a wonderful idea to me. Before, say, things like public books and Words Without Borders and so on, I mean, before that, very occasionally, you would get a foreign book in the TLS reviewed that was, bringing you information from a language that you might not read or about a book that you might not have heard of. But it's hard to know, yes, how you would have the resources to do that, and I have a feeling that you'd get slapped down if you tried to do it. I mean, if I tried to propose it, it's one thing to say, well, I'd like to write about, whoever, Laszlo Krasnohorkai or something. But that's already, I mean, it may be that my editor doesn't really know anything about Laszlo Krasnohorkai, but at least New Directions, an American publisher, has made the gamble and translated it, and there is the proof copy ready to be reviewed. It's another thing if I went and said, well, don't want to write about Krasnohorkai, but there's another Hungarian writer who hasn't yet been translated into English, who I think we should write about. I think it would be wonderful to be able to do that. That's utopian, isn't it? But I don't know how.
You'd have to know Hungarian.
Well, that would be a start. But you were even holding out the possibility that I might not even have to know Hungarian, that I might get that someone could I could almost commission the intelligence on the book, as it were.
Yeah, well, I think there's a huge community of people who are just children of people who've been moving and who've been traveling, and so there is a massive community of people who can speak a lot of languages and who find different countries important. I mean, people who are like Hungarian, Ethiopian, Swedish, and that intelligence is there, and I feel like it's not intelligence, even just lack of skill, and I think it's not being tapped yet, so I'm curious about how that will go.
I do certainly think that's producing it's producing a certain kind of fiction at the moment, which I do think probably does deserve to be called, for better or worse, a kind of global novel, which is a fiction of migrancy rather than immigration, where you can go both back and forward or to multiple places. And you can see that happening in just at the level of content in quite a number of writers. But you're right, it doesn't seem to be producing correspondingly the same kind of review.
And to Florent, I'd like to direct a kind of ancillary question to you based on our questioner. Have you been able to kind of seed reviews in the wider media sphere based on your position as reviewers from the Academy? I mean, how does La Vie des Idées relate to the big daily publications in France? Is there a relationship there? Are you able to expand the possibilities of review from your seat?
Well, it's difficult to know. I think it's a local experience. La Vie des Idées, it's a specific experience based on academic relationship, and it's difficult to me to say that this experience can be a model of a review in academic fields in everywhere, That's your question? Yeah. This is not exactly.
Well, I guess has La Vie des Idées been able to push the media sphere into new areas? Yeah. But you don't.
No.
You're saying you don't.
No.
So I think we have time for one more question. So I apologize to our penultimate questioner will be our last questioner.
Hi, my name is Ross Hofberg. I'm co-founder of a publishing house called New Vessel Press. Actually, James and I were on a panel in Bulgaria together. And we specialize in literature and translation. And right now my partner is at the Frankfurt Book Fair, choosing titles. And one of the things that's good and bad about dealing with literature and translation is that there is some sort of global literature which we're not interested in. I mean, we're not looking to publish the new Italian novel about an Italian who takes a road trip across America. And there's that book from every single country, I promise you. So because so few books get published in translation, we don't have to be so of the moment, right? We can take a look at an Italian publisher catalog, say, okay, you published this book 10 years ago, it's still a great book, and it's still not picked up. And we can choose to publish that, but then you're battling, and this is what I like to hear about, on the other side, you're battling with, literary reviews where they might say, okay, but this is dealing with, this took place in 2010, right? This is a book that deals with events from the distant past. And so, we don't want to cover this. The New York Times sometimes reviews our books. They're always the books about Paris. And so, how do you, from your side, what's the sort of battle between, okay, this is a new book, right? It's of the moment, and this is just a really good book that lasts as a piece of literature, and yes, it might have been written in 2005, but it still deserves review.
Well, I like that question because it's something that I've thought of, I think about a lot because, I used, when I worked at the New Republic, which I keep citing as a counterexample, which it is in a lot of ways, we would publish 8,000 words about Tirso de Molina, or like sauntering through the nooks and crannies of some ancient Hebrew text, just because the mood sort of struck the literary editor at the time. There was a righteous anti-commercial instinct that I admired in a lot of ways, but that does not apply at Slate or in most of the media as I understand it. Even if you're writing about something old, it has to have what's crudely called a peg. Like you have to somehow be able to contextualize it or prove that it's relevant in the current, political or cultural landscape. And so there's a kind of editorial jujitsu that happens if you want to write about something that you think is worthy, but it doesn't, but feels a little stale or a little absent or a little remote from them now, you have to justify it. So that's something in meetings we do a lot. Well, this book came out a few years ago, but I think it really it said something about, Trump and demagoguery, and here's why. So that's and something you can do, but you have to. There's some acrobatics involved in making those connections.
Just to add something as well, like in terms of how we work as well at Chimurenga, because the classic format of the book review is that the book is only valuable if it's new. And one of the things we try and step away from is that kind of tyranny of newness that the publishers keep sending you this book, and therefore because it's come out, it's worthy of review. So even books that have come out in 2010 are still relevant. I was thinking back to our last issue. I think we had an essay there about, sorry, this is not translation, but we had an essay about a guy writing about James Baldwin's letters to his brother. But they had it was a 4,000 word essay, but there's no kind of, you can't go and buy the letters afterwards, but there's real value in publishing that we saw. So I think there's a need for that as well, to kind of escape always from this new. Sorry, I'm going to...
I think we have to be aware of the fact that we are not publishers of books. So in a way, it'd be great maybe to write an essay about what's happening with new weird literature in France. I am aware of the fact that there is new weird literature in France, like authors like Volodine, because they've been translated into Italian and I've been able to read them. I can read English perfectly, so I don't have that problem with American writers. I can't read French well enough, so I wouldn't be able to know if that was a great book or just follow the plot vaguely. So I think it comes down to language. If there's someone who is willing to translate something, then I think our responsibility might be that as people who review books, to put that spotlight on the literature of other countries, make sure that our readers are aware that there is a wealth of incredible literature from all over the world, that things are complicated and interesting and weird and sexy all over the world. But if our readers are then not able to read that book, then I think that's a very basic problem. Like, why am I doing this? Who am I doing this for? It'd be great if we would be able to influence the publishers and be like, this is great, you should publish it. But how would we know if it's great if we weren't able to read it? So I think publishers have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to make sure that quality is seen and that international complex stories from diverse backgrounds are read. But I think that's our limit, that we can't go beyond that.
Well, it's interesting that you just said the word limit, both because we've hit the limit of our time here, but because in trying to sum up, I've been thinking about what we've heard today, and I think all of our speakers have been talking both about the limits of the limits that we place on ourselves and that reviewers and editors are facing, limits of language, limits of currency and time, limits of readers' patience and openness, but also we are hearing really important points about the limits of limitlessness, that certain kinds of local knowledges and intense inhabitations of a space and time matter in literature. And that we're also, I really appreciate hearing from the audience as well, that there are people in every nation who transcend those limits. And perhaps what we can think of as we move forward is how we can open up our book reviewing spaces to people who have a particular relationship to language that is both of this moment of forced flows and migrancies, but transcends borders, transcends monolingualism, transcends even some of our specialized knowledge that we here in the Academy value so much. So I'm going to ask you in a second to join me in thanking our speakers again, but logistically, we will begin our keynote address by James Wood at 4:30. The bathroom is in the very bottom floor of this building. The sunshine is right outside the door if you want to get a little bit of that. And please help me thank our speakers.
Well, that's interesting.
Translation software and the combination of those two.
So one of the things about how that software works is it almost always translates things into English first. So if you're trying to translate from French into Hebrew, most of the current software will translate the French into English and the English into Hebrew. So it really gets at the point that Anjum was making about how everything is homogenized vis-a-vis a kind of Anglo-American or English language dominance. And also, I use those programs, like I'll use Chrome to read a website that's published in another language, because you can use Google Chrome to it'll just put things into whatever language you set, and it has a long way to go. It's gibberish most of the time.
That wasn't really the question I was asking. I was asking to think into the future, not that far if we listen to futurists, where artificial intelligence will just use as a tool the translation software to grasp the overview of a book, the intent of the author, and do the translation through artificial intelligence.
Well, I'd be really interested to have a panel of translators and computer scientists. Like, you're giving me an idea for the next event. Talk about that, because I think that a lot of people who are professional translators of literature, because literary language is not like other language. I mean, every literary theory has pointed to the distinctiveness of literary language. And I think a lot of professional translators of literature would say that probably the best we can hope for is to have AI and human translators work together if what you're going to do is translate literature into literature. Now, if you want to translate literature into SparkNote's version of the literature, I'm sure that we can get there very fast. We're probably already there.
And I'm not referring to what is available now, but what futurists tell us is going to be available. Scaringly soon.
But are the futurists really talking about how you translate Yeats or?
Yes, I think they are. And
well, it's
there's
interesting.
that
I think that
example.
would be fantastic if it worked, because then anyone could read anything, and then what we would learn is that most of us only want to read what's familiar, even if other things are available. And I think it would come back to the point Tim was making, is that it can be very, like, in some ways when you read literature from another place in time, the more particular it is, the more accessible it is, because it just goes into so much detail that you can really enter this person's world. But often we read because we want to learn more about ourselves, and we gravitate to what's familiar. So it's not clear to me that people would read more literature in translation even if there were more literature. And I do think a lot of it has to do with how one feels about the place of one's country in the world. So I think everyone in Italy knows Dante, because Dante is part of Italy's contribution to world culture. But I think probably there's more translated because I think many of them are more excited about reading something from somewhere else because they don't feel like they're in a country that's currently the center of the universe. I mean, I'm not saying I don't endorse any of that.
But there was a story a couple of weeks ago of the artificial intelligence that finally beat a very good Chinese game with Go. They finally won at Go.
That's different. That's about calculating as many moves as possible as fast as possible.
No, that's not the way it works.
No? That's how most games work.
Right, but this is different. And I'll get over my head real quick. But
I'm not saying it's not possible.
That's what artificial
I'm not saying it's not possible. Really, I think the interesting question is, even if it happened, I don't know how much that would change. And I think your question is pointing at an assumption in the conversation, which is if more literature were available in translation, more people would read it. I'm not sure they would.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to run downstairs before the next event. Thank you.
Yeah, it looks unopened, I think. Yeah, so I guess it's fine, because it's just ham. It's a keynote. Then I think it'll be done after that. Yeah. Cookies are good, though. Good. Good. Do you find... Do you find Liz? No, I heard her. She might just be the master. Okay. But I'll just wait. I just have to get a text from James, so I'll see you on Sure. I believe so. Well, there's a reception. There's a reception, yeah. So there'll be a chance. Yeah. Everything else smoothly, I think. So far, so good. And we're like pretty on time still, which is good. I'm surprised. I didn't have to. Figured it out. Editorial assistant. Yeah. So I'm only part-time, but yeah. I'm in editorial and fact check, a bunch of stuff. Actually, not ultimately. I'm really interested more in the trade side of things, but also with like agenting particularly. So yeah, a little bit different, but it's still like yeah, really good experience. And a lot of digital stuff that like I'm learning about that I had no idea how to do at all. So it's always a good skill. Yeah. I can say that I'm like a true millennial now. Yeah. I know how to do digital things. Like, I still don't know how to do Twitter. So. Oh yeah, no, I have a Twitter, but like I'm not super active on it. I'm working on it. Yeah, no, it's been really good so far. It's been like a great experience. Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm glad. We were worried about the rain. I know. I was really worried. Yeah. Oh yeah. And I was like, no one's gonna come. But yeah, it all worked out pretty nicely. Still busy. So the other day we had a conference last week. Oh wow. So it was just like nonstop.
Okay, we're starting. Sorry. We'll have a reception after. We are going to begin because it is Friday and it's 4:30. Seems like a good time to get started. So what I'm going to do, for those of you who weren't here earlier, I'm Sharon Marcus with Kate Zaloom. I'm one of the 2 founding editors of Public Books. I'm also Dean of Humanities and a professor of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia. I am going to very briefly introduce Nicholas Dames, who is then going to introduce our keynote speaker, James Wood. So Nicholas Dames is the Theodore Kahan Professor of Humanities in the Department of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia University. He's one of the best critics writing today on the novel, its theory, its history, and its form. He has received every teaching award Columbia has to offer. We may have to invent a new one soon for him. And he is the author of 2 important and widely admired books, Amnesiac Selves, Nostalgia, Forgetting, and British Fiction, 1810 to 1870, published by Oxford University Press in 2001, and The Physiology of the Novel, Reading, Neural Science, and the Form of Victorian Fiction, also published by Oxford in 2007. Currently, Professor Dames is completing a book about the history of the chapter, which will be published by Princeton University Press. In addition to his scholarly books and articles, Professor Dames has also written about contemporary fiction and other topics for The Atlantic, N+1, New Left Review, The New Yorker, and, of course, Public Books, for which he also recently began to serve as literary fiction editor. As a critic, Nick has ruthlessly good taste, an incisive sense of history and form, and a prodigal abundance of the graceful, limber rhetorical elegance known as sprezzatura. I can think of no one better to introduce our keynote speaker, James Wood. Please welcome Professor Nicholas Dames to the podium to do just that.
Thank you, Sharon. It's an honor to introduce James Wood, who really needs no introduction, but unlike many who merit that phrase, he's actually difficult to summarize. His work is wide and complex enough that one scarcely knows where to begin. Perhaps one might begin with the fact that Wood has managed the extraordinary feat of having one foot in academic and journalistic worlds both. Since 2003, he's taught at Harvard University, where he is now professor of the practice of literary criticism. He's written for numerous publications, as has already been discussed, but is most commonly associated with The Guardian, where he was chief literary critic from 1991 to 1995, The New Republic, where he was senior editor from 1995 to 2007, and The New Yorker, where he is now a staff writer and book critic. If there's been a significant work of prose fiction written since the fall of the Berlin Wall, Wood has likely weighed in on it. He does not, however, limit himself to the contemporary. He's written on Tolstoy, Hardy, Lawrence, Svevo, Green, and Orwell, and many others in that mid-19th to mid-20th century period, dotted with well-known and obscure masterpieces alike. His literary criticism fills 5 books, and he has himself written 1 novel. Rumor has it that a second is under gestation. Like the best critics, his taste or predilections are very difficult to classify, although many have tried. He's sometimes known as a proponent of realism, although there are whole wide expanses of undoubtedly realist fiction he does not praise, and many styles far from obviously realist that he does. He's still known for his famous 2000 essay defining hysterical realism, but actually inventing generic categories in order to denounce them is not really characteristic of his work at all. He's perhaps more of a close reader, a critic who tries to attune himself to the tones of a particular work, more than that than a theorist of tendencies or groups. He's often described as possessing a particularly religious sensibility, but he in fact has insisted on the novel as an inescapably secular form. He's had the honor of being attacked, and even greatest honor of all, parodied by novelists, but without, unlike many, having tried to earn that honor by vituperation, which is, of course, the easiest way for a critic to get a reputation. He's also, of course, an Englishman by birth and a longtime resident of the United States who writes often of writers from far outside the Anglophone world. If you had to start somewhere, though, you might say that one clue to Wood's sensibility is his background and enduring interest in music. This means he has a sensitivity to fiction as music, as a form, not just as a prose report on existence. It also means that he's always aware of the privilege and the difficulty of working, unlike the music critic, in the same medium as the object of one's inquiry. He's recently written of a kind of criticism he calls passionate redescription, less an argument about a book than a close or even intimate paraphrase, an evocation of a particularly skilled reader's experience that would enable other readers to see the book as the critic has seen it. Now, this is both like and somewhat unlike, as Wood has suggested, the interpretive recreation of a musical performance. But one thing it requires is, like the musician, a kind of virtuosic ear, and this Wood exhibits in all his criticism. Please join me in welcoming James Wood.
Thank you, Nicholas, very much indeed. That was really one of the most touching things I've heard about myself. That was really, really lovely. Thank you, and from someone who, as I said to you in my email, I've been reading with utmost admiration and pleasure, and learning a lot from too. Those of you who haven't read him on Knausgaard should immediately go out and find particularly the essay that appeared in Public Books on Volume 3, which I think did important work. It sort of it sealed a particular moment calmly and coolly, in which I had been a part, definitely, but came with a reappraising intelligence. So I have to confess in advance that I've been really struggling with the form of this talk, which is maybe appropriate because I'm in a way talking about form, the form of the review, the form of fiction versus the form of life. But I have been struggling, and I think it falls into three, not very helpfully, into three parts, but not very coherently. The first, I just want to talk a little bit about growing up and why I became a critic. I think that might be of interest. Secondly, I thought it might be useful to look at a book I reviewed and then compare it with how I've been able to teach that book and read it more sophisticatedly and more slowly in the years since I reviewed it. And then thirdly, I just want to talk a little bit more about what Nicholas was mentioning, a particular obsession of mine, criticism as passionate redescription and requotation. I also have a couple of excellent props, this marvelous book called Novels and Novelists, which I'm going to display to you, and 1,300 pages of the collected essays of V.S. Pritchard, a great book. So, will they fall off there? Yeah, hang on, I'll put them here. I grew up in the age of the newspaper book review. I hesitated to call it a golden age because it doubtless just felt more or less silvery to me at the time. And because this kind of nostalgia is unjustified, my sense is that in many ways we're currently living in a golden age, if not of the journalistic book review, then certainly of the long review essay. And that's, of course, largely thanks to the room that the internet, if not the money, but certainly the room that the internet gives to people to write long in a way that certainly wasn't the case when I was growing up in the United Kingdom. So it was a different moment from now, the difference mainly marked by the prominence and quality of newspaper book reviewing. This was Britain in the late 70s and 1980s, when a high-minded lit botherer like myself, growing up in a provincial university town in the north of England, several hundred miles from London, could get a very decent literary education from the daily and Sunday newspapers. For an earlier generation, particularly in America, that education was conducted in libraries as well as in schools. Nowadays, I presume it's online. Certainly it's for me. But for me then, it was the newspapers. This was where I read about novelists or poets I'd never actually read. It's where I learned how to write, how to argue, how to polemicize if need be. And it was from the newspapers that as a teenager I learned my burgeoning vocabulary. I kept a studious list of unfamiliar words like Jeremiad, emollient, and indeed burgeon. The book sections of two Sunday newspapers in Britain, the Sunday Times and the Observer, functioned like rivalrous but overlapping magisteria. And the incumbent critics, the monarchs of these two kingdoms, were the novelist Anthony Burgess, who wrote a long weekly review for the Observer, and the critic and essayist Cyril Connolly, who wrote the same for the Sunday Times. Okay, I get it. I admit it, it was a golden age. Burgess and Connolly were both superb writers with an easy command of entire traditions and of several languages, though they were very different. Burgess was a serious and ambitious novelist with a commitment to difficult modernist and postmodern work. Connolly was a patrician classicist who had grown up in the era of modernism, but whose own inclination tended towards 18th century aphorism and fin de siècle aestheticism. They weren't alone, of course, though their fortunate eminence sometimes resembled solitude. They were accompanied by many distinguished regular critics, some of them academics, Hermione Lee, George Steiner, Lorna Sage, Raymond Williams, John Carey, Frank Commode, John Bailey. Others were former academics, the ruins of their abandoned PhDs still clinging to them, Peter Ackroyd. And others still were poets and novelists who were also working literary journalists, people like Ian Hamilton, Angela Carter, Martin Amis, and V.S. Pritchard. It was this last group, the writer-critics, the practitioners who were also thinking about their art, that interested me most. Through them, I felt connected to the essayistic tradition that includes, in English, Johnson, Coleridge, De Quincey, Arnold, Ruskin, Woolf, Orwell, Jarrell, Anonta, Hardwick, and Sontag. I hadn't read most of these writers, of course, as a teenager, though I did, as I said earlier, fall in love with Orwell at an early age and eagerly read everything by him, sensibly preferring, as every reader does, the essays to the weaker fiction. It was natural to me then, as it is now, to read essays as I read fiction or poetry in a borderless country where the sentence roams freely, crossing generic divisions and booksellers' demarcations. This writer's criticism is what I want to talk about, both its limitations and its triumphs. I believe that that tradition was signaling to me as a teenager, again, long before I could put the apprehension into words, that writing and thinking about literature could be an activity not just analogous to, but the same as writing literature. That writing and thinking about literature wasn't only a matter of aesthetics or philosophy or historical scholarship, but was importantly fed by life and living, by the interruptions and eruptions of daily existence, politics, travail, distraction, banality. And that thinking and writing about literature wasn't confined to school or university, but had gone on around and outside the academy, long before the rise of the discipline we know as literary studies. This last fact, again felt as an apprehension rather than as a fact, was important to me as a teenager growing up in a university town whose father was a university professor. We lived on a street lousy with profs. I could stand outside our house and look down the road identifying each subject: zoology, our own home, sociology next door, modern history 3 doors down, and at the bottom of the street was the fearsome and amazingly unlikable Dr. Wright, whom we kids knew only as the reader in classical epigraphy. A truly horrid man. And like some kids' book from the 1920s, he would actually shake his fist at us and say, "Confound you!" when we did terrible things. Like any sensible child and good novelistic hero, I was desperate to escape my provincial background, which also meant escaping the academy. That I now live and work in a small university town represents the kind of poetic justice that takes a lifetime's wisdom to comprehend. So, reading literary journalism in the newspapers reminded me of a tradition and offered the exciting possibility that the tradition was still a living one, that I might be able to go to London and earn a living by writing. It wouldn't be easy. My religious and petty bourgeois parents were flummoxed by an ambition that seemed to them unambitious. What was the point of all that education if I was going to squander it on something as nebulous as freelance book reviewing? Was this a serious activity? Was it, at bottom, a moral activity? It's one thing to announce, "I'm going to London to write in the tradition of Connolly, Orwell, and Woolf," and another to do it. Getting to London was hard enough, but getting to London was crucial. Not Cambridge, not Oxford, not Durham, my native town, but the capital city, sooty with ink stains, argumentative, irresponsible, careless, skeptical, a snobbish hardship, where I could be paid cheaply for my expensive words. And where, as I increasingly understood it, I could join a tradition that existed before Oxford, Edinburgh, Paris, Yale, and Harvard, not to mention Columbia, took it up. Hazlitt on poetry and boxing, Baudelaire on Goya and walking, Woolf on modernism and driving, Benjamin on Proust and asthma. This tradition of writerly criticism, as I see it, perseveres and continues. Think of Joseph Brodsky's essays on poetry, of Milosz on Dostoevsky, Kundera or Coetzee on the novel, Zadie Smith, Ali Smith, and David Foster Wallace, just in the Anglophone tradition, on contemporary fiction, and so on. Such criticism is unafraid of making use of anything that comes to mind or hand. Mark Greif, a founder of the journal N+1, has quoted Kenneth Burke, himself a non-attached, free-floating American intellectual who dropped out of Columbia in order to write, on the proper basis for criticism. Quote, "The main ideal of criticism is to use all there is to use," close quotes. Greif continues wisely, "This precedes Burke, as many great critics' method, and it will outlast those of us doing our short span of work now." I had an ally in my determination to earn a living by writing literary essays, and the ally was the English novelist, short story writer, and critic V.S. Pritchett, who was born in 1900 and died in 1997. He was so old and eminent when I was growing up that he had already disappeared while still alive into a vague posterity. He was cloudily venerable. He was the best short story writer, though, in Britain since Kipling, and the most serious critic since Virginia Woolf, admired by Frank Kermode, who often praised him as the best living British critic. So those of us who thought that was actually Kermode disagreed. Anita Bruckner, Eudora Welty, and Martin Amis were also strong admirers. Pritchett had written regularly in the 40s and 50s for the New Statesman. Towards the end of his life, he contributed to the New Yorker, the London Review of Books, and the New York Review of Books. He was still writing occasionally when I was growing up, and one of the first pieces I wrote for The Guardian when I started working for that newspaper in 1988 was an interview with my aged literary hero, as old as the century. Pritchett left school at the age of 15 and spent the next 10 years traveling around Europe, particularly in France and Spain. Like Virginia Woolf, who of course also lacked a university degree, he was a fiend of self-education, almost certainly the only English writer since her who had read all of Sir Walter Scott. At one point near the end of his life, I don't know if it was in my interview, he confessed that he was slightly horrified by how much he'd read. Rather like that. He was formidably learned, though in a familiar English manner tended to disguise the difficulty of learning by a display of easy performance. When his complete essays appeared in 1989, the scope of his critical achievement, which is probably greater than his fictional achievement, was clear. In 1,300 pages, over several hundred long essays, Pritchett moves through the entire novelistic traditions of America, Russia, England, France, Italy, and Spain. He was a fluent reader of French and Spanish. His calendar, essentially, is Rabelais onwards. Salman Rushdie was the last appointment, at least in this book. He reviewed Midnight's Children very appreciatively. So here is this wonderful book, which really was my university. So let's put it this way. At university, I was taught how to read texts, and that was tremendously important. It was the best thing the university could have given me. I wouldn't say this book taught me how to read text, but what it did give me was all the books that I didn't get at university. So if you just open it up, it begins with, there's Edward Gibbon, that you can't exactly see it, but an extraordinary number of writers are covered. Dostoevsky, Stendhal, Proust, Pushkin, Simone de Beauvoir. Anyway, you dip in, it's there. And I really did use it as a resource. Still do sometimes, in fact. The book taught me, as I said, how to read and write, if not how to read in a close way. First, it introduced me to writers I had never read. I read Pritchett on Balzac and Stendhal long before I read their work. Second, he taught me how to quote. He's a great quoter, and if you're not a great quoter, you can't be a great critic. Third, he taught me how to write. In scope and comprehensive range, his American rival was Edmund Wilson, and they were roughly contemporaneous, I guess. They exchanged polite, edgy letters. Wilson is more obviously ambitious and canonical, where Pritchett is a reader's secret. Compared with Pritchett, Wilson's essays have a vigorous alienation from their subjects. They chew through books to the cardboard and sometimes seem rather grimly intent on the same universal mastication, where the subject is Dante or Dickens, Poe or Pushkin. It was John Berryman who said of Wilson that, whenever you encountered him at a literary party and you said, "What are you working on?" he would always say, "I'm working my way through." It was always that sort of, the oeuvre of the particular, I'm working my way through. Pritchett, by contrast, approaches fiction gently, seemingly anxious not to overwhelm the form with strong comprehension. He boards it like one might board a ship, from the side, not the front. Unlike Wilson, he seems to swim in the same fluid as his subjects, which is to say he uses a literary language to write about literary language. He's both metaphorical and aphoristic, often using a picture, like a good novelist, to seize a quick, large, essential, primary truth. About Dickens, for instance, he writes that modern imitators of that novelist find it fairly easy to go out into a London street and pick up people who behave as funny Dickensian characters and simply record them. But Dickens, he writes, quote, did far more than that. He saw that they were people whose inner life was hanging out, so to speak, on their tongues, outside their persons. Dickens's characters, he continued, are strange, even mad, because they speak as if they were the only persons in the world. They live by some private idea or fiction. Our comedy, he continues, our comedy, Dickens seems to say, is not in our relations with others, but in our relation with ourselves, our lives, our poetry, our genius. His marvelous essays are full of lusters like this, sentences that compact lived wisdom, deep literary knowledge, and astonishing figurative power into gentle aphorism. And I'm just going to read a few to give you a taste. This is a line on Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky was a spiritual sensationalist, a man of God somewhat stained with the printing ink of the late night final. Turgenev, who knew English literature well, used to say that he envied the English novelists their power to make plots, but of course he really disdained it. Why do the novels of Ada Leveson survive? How is it that these ices of the Edwardian drawing room have kept their crispness and have not melted away? On Henry Green, some very fine artists impose themselves, but Henry Green belonged to those who masochistically seek to let their characters speak through them. In so speaking, they may expose more than they know, but don't we all stubbornly feel that, for better or worse, we are more than we know? There is a muddled justification for our existence. We are encrusted in something like a private culture. Well, this on Pepys and Boswell. The only serious rival to Pepys is Boswell, but Boswell is a snail without a shell. He trails through life unhoused and exclamatory, whereas Pepys is housed and sotto voce. And here he is on, he reviewed, I think it was Humboldt's Gift when it came out in 1975, so here he is beginning his long review of Humboldt's Gift, Saul Bellow's novel, an essay that's called Jumbos. Saul Bellow, he writes, has the most effusive intelligence of living American novelists. Even when he is only clever, he has a kind of spirited intellectual vanity that enables him to take on all the facts and theories about the pathetic and comically exposed condition of civilized man and distribute them like high-class corn so that the chickens come running to them. That is the art of the novelist who can't resist an idea, to evoke, attract that pleasing, anxious being, the squawking, dusty, feverish human chicken. Aldous Huxley could always throw the corn, but nothing alive came fluttering to it. See, when you read that stuff, you're 17, you think, oh, bloody hell, that's the way to go. Great, yeah? Discussing Russian nationalism in that country's fiction, Pritchett writes, we are moved by it, I think this is very shrewd, we are moved by it because of the strangeness of meeting a nationalism rooted not in pride, but in humility. On fictional life, one of the reasons why bad novels are bad is not that the characters do not live, but that they do not live with one another. And this in a small essay on the minor Victorian novelist George Gissing. The great Russian novels of the 19th century arose from the failure of a class, whereas the English sprang out of their success. Aphorism is common enough in English criticism, but it's rare for a writer to mix aphorism and metaphor as well as Pritchett does. In an essay on Ford Madox Ford, he argues that Ford was perhaps too brilliant, too facile and self-conscious to be a great novelist. Quote, "He never sank into the determined stupor out of which great novelists work." In 2 words, determined stupor, Pritchett achieves the paradoxical idea of an artist having to will himself into sleep. Woolf once complained in similar vein that E.M. Forster was like a light sleeper, always coming into the next room to interrupt his characters. What I like about Pritchett's work is what I try to do in my own, to tell a story about a story, to evaluate, to attend to intention. Things that seem peculiar sometimes to the non-academic, or particular, should we say, to the non-academic literary tradition. But the weaknesses are very apparent too. Pritchett may generalize, but he doesn't theorize. The purity of his emphasis on fiction alone sometimes means that he seems wary of being violated by an idea. His work rests on vast reading, but it's an art not premised on the Barthian ideal of rereading. It can seem, by contemporary standards, hazy, impressionistic, biographical where it should be formal, psychological where it should be technical. And you might say in some ways it hasn't always aged very well. Journalism is first. Journalism comes first, and this primacy is a large part of its vitality. But reading is a secondary activity, and not just haplessly a secondary activity, but ideally so. How to make rereading a vital act, an act of primacy, I take to be the daily burden of the teacher. And in that regard, I want to talk a slight switch of gears, but I hope it makes sense. I want to talk about a novel that I reviewed in 2011 for The New Yorker, and which I've taught, I think, since 2012 at Harvard, and how those are different forms of reading, which are ideally complementary. The novel is Teju Cole's Open City, which I know a number of you will be familiar with. I can remember when it came through, came in the mail. I did not know anything about Teju Cole. I gathered while I was writing the review that he had, I think, started writing the book while here at Columbia as a graduate student in art history. But I didn't know anything about it. It was sort of thing where the literary editor suggested it to me and said, I think, there's some buzz about this. You'll know what those of you who've read the book will know what it's about, that a flanneurial sort of alter ego, as it were, of Teju Cole's, called Julius, a psychiatric intern with a medical degree, starts going on Sibaldian walks through New York City. There's also a moment in the middle of the book when he travels to Brussels and has an encounter, it's the longest scene in the book, with a Moroccan intellectual who seems increasingly, as they get to know each other, sort of proto-terroristic. What did I get right when I look back at the review? I saw that it was indebted to Sebald. I put it in its tradition in that regard, and I also likened it to Naipaul's The Enigma of Arrival, which was a hunch that was then confirmed when I met Cole, and he said, indeed, the sort of evenness of prose that he was aiming for in Open City was something he had admired in Naipaul's The Enigma of Arrival. I understood that the book I mean, I got the central element of the book, which is that through the unreliability of the narrator, it offers a critique of a kind of connoisseurial and flanneurial global liberalism. That this is someone, as it were, very like you and me, full of the right kind of texts, Roland Barthes, Walter Benjamin, Edward Said, and so on, who has all the right impulses, indeed more adventurous impulses than certainly I do. He wants actually to open himself to stories of otherness, Liberian refugees, Haitian shoeshiners, Farouk, the Moroccan intellectual in Brussels. And that these seemingly modify his sensibility not at all, not in crucial ways. Or rather, that he knows a lot, but he doesn't do anything about his knowledge. And it's obviously a very interesting book because the reader's experience of the book then becomes, overlaps completely with Julius's own flanneurial existence. That's to say, the book, I think, challenges us not to become flaneurs of the text itself, not to be like Julius, not to simply pile up our experiences of otherness as we encounter them in the book and then do nothing about them. I didn't get that last bit. So what I would say is, in preceding the last 3 or 4 years, I've been able to think much harder about what might have seemed to me as a reviewer more abstract questions, reader and audience, the tension between saturation and selection, which is a tension obviously embedded in the realist tradition, which I think Cole very brilliantly mobilizes in his novel, or remobilizes as a tension, as a moral tension. What is the moral and political tension between noticing and not noticing, between ignoring and choosing to see. When I teach it, that's how I teach it. And I think were I to write an essay now about the book, it would be a much better essay. When I look back at my review, I see those weaknesses and other weaknesses, a certain breeziness, a lack of academic rigor, the temptation often taken to float a thought without having to defend it, the temptation to secure a point by rhetorical performance rather than argumentative labor. And I wonder now whether, even if I had understood all those things about the book first time, whether in some way I would have been permitted to write about the tension between saturation and selection in the realist tradition, the flanneurial tradition, the relationship of reader to audience that the book is obsessively involved in. I don't mean not literally permitted by my editor. I mean that I wonder if the discourse, as I have internalized it, of broadly popular, albeit highbrow literary reviewing, would allow me to speak that academic language. If I did rewrite my review, it would be a better essay, I think, but perhaps the result would be an explication, a teaching, a preachment, rather than a first performance. I don't know. Maybe something would be lost. As I said, Cole's novel is precisely about the relation of reading to action, the flaneur, the reader who does nothing. Perhaps my review, then, is a piece of action, an act of life, while the danger of finding a form in which one can calmly say something like, Cole's novel is precisely about the relation of reading to action, is that what one has gained in retrospective mastery, one has lost of primal apprehension. Perhaps error and imprecision, the liberation of unreason, are crucial structural elements of any review. I mean, think for a second of how extraordinarily unreasonable, by and large, the critical tradition is. Proust on Sainte-Beuve would be a famous example, but more recently, wonderful little book by Gabriel Jospovici about modernism, called What Happened to Modernism, where he just goes full tilt against contemporary, a version of contemporary postmodernism that he doesn't like. I'm not sure, I'm really not sure. Like a demented Thomas Bernhardt character, or to be less grand and probably more accurate, more like a character out of Jeff Dyer, I'm caught between two places. When I'm teaching, I want to be writing because conversation is air. And when I'm writing, I want to be doing the kind of reading I can only do, apparently, when I'm not writing, or not writing for a living. Reading as life, writing as life. My favorite literary essays always seem to be negotiating a relation between literary form and the forms of life. Take Thomas de Quincey's famous essay on the knocking at the gate in Macbeth. De Quincey tries to explain why he is so affected by the scene in Act 2 of Macbeth, when, after the murder of the king, a knocking is heard on the gate. You'll remember, the porter arrives, tells us about the ups and downs of heavy drinking, and slowly opens the door. Macduff and Lennox have arrived and are looking for the king. De Quincey recognized when he saw the play that something strange occurs at this moment, some peculiar shift. But he can't work out why. The problem, he decides, is that he was trying to use his understanding, as he puts it, and yet he reminds us the understanding is not helpful, but actually obstructs proper analysis. He writes, "The mere understanding, however useful and indispensable, is the meanest faculty in the human mind, and the most to be distrusted. And yet the great majority of people trust to nothing else." His example: ask someone to draw a street, anyone who is not previously prepared for the demand by a knowledge of perspective. That person will allow her understanding to overrule her eyes. She'll draw a horizontal line because that is what she thinks she should do, and will fail to produce the desired pictorial effect. De Quincey continues that his understanding could furnish him with no reason as to why the knocking at the gate should have any special effect. In fact, he writes, "My understanding said positively that it could not produce any effect. But I knew better. I felt that I did. And I waited and clung to the problem until further knowledge should enable me to solve it." Close quote. But like a good essayist, he tells a story about a story. He takes his time withholding exactly what that solution is. When we see someone faint, says De Quincey, the most affecting moment is when the person comes round, and this announces the recommencement of suspended life. Or one might be walking in a great city like London on the day of some national funeral, when the streets are empty and stilled. And then the return to life, after the funeral is over, suddenly reminds us, he writes, of the earlier suspension of ordinary business. Quote, "All action in any direction is best expounded, measured, and made apprehensible by reaction." Now, he says, apply this to Macbeth. He concludes that in order for us to appreciate the play, we have to feel sympathy for the murderer. Further, that we enter into his feelings and are made to understand them. When Macbeth and his wife do their dreadful deeds, ordinary, healthy life ceases. But we were not aware of that suspension because we were spending our time in Macbeth's mind through his soliloquies. The knocking is what he calls the pulse of life beginning to beat again. And the re-establishment of the goings-on of the world in which we live first make us profoundly sensible of the awful parenthesis that had suspended them, close quotes. The most obvious effect of the knocking and the porter's comedy, its jarring difference from the preceding horror, doesn't much interest De Quincey. He assumes that. But then the next most obvious effect, that the knocking is simply the pulse of life returning, doesn't interest him that much either, except insofar as the return of ordinary life reminds us of a previous lack, reminds us that a suspension of life occurred of which we had not been previously aware. Thus, the essay's conclusion to its own riddle is embodied in its form. Just as De Quincey discovers that the knocking reminds us of something we had neglected, the suspension of ordinary life, so his essay stumbles upon a suspension that he had neglected, the suspension of his intuitive intelligence, its death at the hands of what he calls, puzzlingly to us moderns, the understanding. He had to allow that intuition to come back to life. I like, too, that he makes a connection not between the knocking at the door and the knocking of Macbeth's murderous heart Again, the obvious connection encouraged, I think, by Shakespeare, but with the pulse of ordinary life itself. And there's something fine in the way that his essay, to quote Kenneth Burke again, uses all there is to use. He has an interpretive problem to solve, and he treats this not like the hermeneut canted over his well-thumbed text, but like the urban stroller who wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater. He likens Shakespeare's play to a series of murders, famous murders in London in 1812. He reaches for the memory of wandering the city streets during the suspension of ordinary activity. An aesthetic problem is solved in part by living, by ordinary existence. This push and pull between literary form and the form of life is one of the things that obsesses me, and which draws me to the literary review essay as the site of analysis and an ideal enactment of this tension, as the place where these tensions actually get worked out in the form of a kind of narrative, really. It's there in De Quincey's essay, and it's powerfully present in two other essays I read and reread regularly. Lucash's The Foundering of Form Against Life, from his book Soul and Form, and Woolf's review of E.M. Forster's Aspects of the Novel, which appeared in the International Herald Tribune in 1927, and appears in her collected essays as Is Fiction an Art? This review, some of you will know, sort of caused a bit of, she and Forster were never quite, if they really ever had been, but they weren't quite allies ever after that moment. Both Lukács and Woolf, in different but related ways, are trying, like De Quincey, to define life and art and the relation between them. Woolf famously argues against Forster's frequent invocation of life. What is this life, she writes, that keeps on cropping up so mysteriously in books about fiction? I have to say, when I read that, I feel her eyes boring down. What is this life, she says, that keeps on cropping up so mysteriously in books about fiction? Why should a real chair, she writes, be better than an imaginary elephant? Forster, she complains, says almost nothing about words. Fiction is treated as a parasite, which draws her sustenance from life and must, in gratitude, resemble life or perish, she complains. But Woolf mobilizes both art and life in her campaign against Forster. Pattern, form, art is life, she says. We just have to change our definitions of both art and life. Lukács, in his profoundly secular essay, argues that Kierkegaard's attempt to create what Lukács calls forms from life was a kind of religious aestheticism that was confounded by both life and death. Specifically, Lukács is talking about Kierkegaard's decision not to marry Regina Olsen and to make of the choice a monumental gesture. This then, writes Lukács, these are absolutely beautiful words which I read again and again, this then was Kierkegaard's honesty, to see everything as being sharply distinct from everything else, system from life, human being from human being, stage from stage, to see the absolute in life without any petty compromises. And then, beautifully, the secularist turns on the religionist at this moment and peppers him with these questions. This is Lukács continuing. But is it not a compromise to see life as being without compromise? Is not such nailing down of absoluteness an evasion of the duty to look at everything? Is not the denial of a life system itself a system? Is not the leap merely a sudden transition? Can one be honest, continues Lukács, in face of life and yet stylize life's events in literary form? Lukács, I think, uses the secularism of both and, looking at everything, to vanquish Kierkegaard's pure either-or. And the life of these essays lies not just in their frank and questing treatment of life. The life of these essays lies in what they enact both formally and verbally. The vitality of the language and figuration. Lukács likens at one moment Kierkegaard to Napoleon in Russia. Woolf uses not just argument but metaphor against Forster. Fiction, she announces at the start of her review, is a lady who has somehow got herself into trouble from which many gallant gentlemen are ready to rescue her without precisely knowing why. The rest of her essay knowingly reclaims the lady called fiction from a certain tradition of male heartiness. tea parties versus elephants. Woolf genders metaphor in her review. Remember, it's just a review that appeared in the International Herald Tribune, and here we are talking about it as if it's, rightly so, but as if it were, a canonical essay. I said that Pritchard seems to swim in the same fluid as his subjects. Partly this is a kind of passionate redescription that extensive quotation allows us to do in a long review. Partly it's a kind of critical retelling that is a way of writing through books and not just about them. This writing through is often achieved by using the language of metaphor and simile that literature itself uses. It's a recognition, as Nicholas was saying, that literary criticism is unique because one has the great privilege of performing it in the same medium one is describing. When Coleridge writes of Swift that he had the soul of Rabelais but dwelling in a dry place, or when Henry James says that Balzac was so devoted to his work that he became a kind of Benedictine of the actual, a phrase he liked so much he plagiarized himself and also applied to Flaubert. When Pritchard laments in that wonderful phrase that Ford never fell into the determined stupor out of which great work comes, these writers are producing images that are qualitatively indistinguishable from the metaphors and similes in their so-called creative work. They're speaking to literature in its own language. This speaking to literature in its own language is indeed the equivalent of a musical or theatrical performance, an act of critique, which is at the same time a revoicing. There may also be an element of writerly rivalry or proximity, the writer displaying her own talent to the subject. Virginia Woolf's essays would be the great example here, because when she wrote for the TLS, all contributions were anonymous. Her journalism had to sign itself by style. The Chicago philosopher Ted Cohen, in his book Thinking of Others on the Talent for Metaphor, makes a persuasive case that metaphor is central to the ways in which we read fiction and to the ways in which we identify with other characters, how we put ourselves in the shoes of other characters. Cohen starts with the simple, sometimes overlooked fact that metaphor is akin to an imaginative identification. When we say metaphorically that A is B or like B, we're induced to think of A as B, and this leads to new thoughts about A. Cohen says this ability to see A as B is a crucial human gift. That's his title of his book, The Talent for Metaphor. It's not just a poetic talent for making metaphor of the kinds that I just quoted. He thinks it's the engine driving how we identify with characters in novels, because metaphor asks us, as he puts it, to think of one thing as something it is plainly not, what he calls metaphors of personal identification. So he essentially argues that for me to assert, say, I am Barack Obama, or I am Macbeth, is a kind of sympathetic identification that belongs in the family of metaphor. He concedes most people wouldn't consider I am Barack Obama to be a metaphor in the same way that Juliet is the sun is a metaphor. Still, the knack for grasping these sentences is the same as the knack for grasping metaphors. And when we read about fictional characters, a metaphorical transaction is going on. This is because our identification with fictional characters is not a matter of strict identity. We're not like Macbeth or Raskolnikov exactly, but a figurative identification. What would it be like to be like them? When we say that A can be seen as B, we don't posit that A and B share the same properties, but we suggest that B has some property that A can be thought of as having, when in fact the property is not literally a property of A. That's what we found De Quincey arguing in his essay. It's not mentioned by Ted Cohen, but I think we can apply it. De Quincey was keen to point out that we missed the suspension of ordinary life because we'd been identifying with the murderer, but not literally. Shakespeare, he writes, must throw the interest on the murderer. Our sympathy must be with him. Of course, I mean a sympathy of comprehension by which we enter into his feelings and are made to understand them, not a sympathy of pity or approbation, close quote. And then De Quincey enacts his own leap of sympathy, whereby, in order to fathom the effect of that knocking, he must experience for himself what that suspension and reawakening of life actually felt like. Ted Cohen quotes from a paper written in 1949 called Critical Communication by the philosopher Arnold Eisenberg, who was unknown to me, in what Cohen calls an astonishingly brief and effective argument. Eisenberg undermines the common notion that by citing the artwork's property, the critic is producing a reason in support of value judgment. What the critic must hope to do, said Eisenberg, is by drawing attention to the properties of the artwork, induce in his audience a similar view of the work. This way, in Eisenberg's phrase, he might achieve a sameness of vision in his audience, i.e. a sameness of vision between audience and critic. In other words, when I review Teju Cole, and this might be different, I think, from trying to get it right academically in the classroom, I'm not, first time round, necessarily trying to be right about Teju Cole, though I'm trying to be as right as possible, but that's not the, what I'm above all trying to do is trying to aim at a sameness of vision in which I get the audience to see my way of describing the book. Cohen goes on to point out that this is a brilliant description of the use of metaphor. When your metaphor is X is Y, you are hoping that I will see X as you do, namely as Y, and most likely, although your proximate aim is to get me to see X in this way, your ultimate wish is that I will feel about X as you do. What I might add here is that if this sameness of vision is effectively metaphorical, then a language of metaphor, the writer-critic's own metaphoricity, is the embodied language of that process, the very enactment of it. Second, if imaginative identification is at bottom metaphorical, then the reader's or critic's metaphorical identification is very close to the writer's. As Shakespeare must imagine himself into the role of Macbeth, so the reader must do so too, and is thus partaking of a creative act. The readerly act is also the writerly act. And if the critic's writing up of that identification is also metaphorical, then we can bestow a slightly enriched meaning on Arnold Eisenberg's phrase, sameness of vision. We're all, writer, reader, and rewriter, the critic, engaged in a sameness of vision, which is in some ways a sameness of writing. Here are two examples of sameness of vision, sameness of writing. Both are moments of criticism occurring in the world and passages wherein the relation of aesthetic form to the form of life is at stake. One is from Virginia Woolf's biography of her friend and mentor, Roger Fry, an art historian and curator. And one is taken from my own experience of seeing the pianist Alfred Brendel lecture about music. So here is Woolf. It's really a passage if I had a single passage to describe what I think the critic is doing, it would be this passage from her biography. She's describing going to a public lecture in London and watching Roger Fry stand very stiffly, formal in tails and white tie, with a pointer, pointing at slides, Matisse, Cézanne, and so on, and trying to explicate them. And what she likes is that at one moment he can't explicate at all and has to go silent. All that he had done again and again in his books. But here there was a difference. As the next slide slid over the sheet, there was a pause. He gazed afresh at the picture. And then in a flash he found the word he wanted. He added on the spur of the moment what he had just seen, as if for the first time. That, perhaps, was the secret of his hold over his audience. They could see the sensation strike and form. He could lay bare the very moment of perception. So with pauses and spurts, the world of spiritual reality emerged in slide after slide, in Poussin, in Chardin, in Rembrandt, in Cézanne, in its uplands and its lowlands, all connected, all somehow made whole and entire upon the great screen in the Queen's Hall. And finally the lecturer, after looking long through his spectacles, came to a pause. He was pointing to a late work by Cézanne, and he was baffled. He shook his head, his stick rested on the floor. It went, he said, far beyond any analysis of which he was capable. And so instead of saying, next slide, he bowed, and the audience emptied itself into Langham Place. For 2 hours, they had been looking at pictures, but they had seen one of which the lecturer himself was unconscious, the outline of the man against the screen, an ascetic figure in evening dress who paused and pondered and then raised his stick and pointed. That was a picture that would remain in memory together with the rest, a rough sketch that would serve many of the audience in years to come as the portrait of a critic, a man of sensibility but of exacting honesty who, when reason could penetrate no further, broke off, but was convinced and convinced others that what he saw was there. It's all here in that lovely passage. Criticism as creation, as if for the first time. Criticism as modesty, as the mind putting the understanding into abeyance. He was baffled. Criticism as simplicity and near silence. It went, he said, far beyond any analysis of which he was capable. Criticism as sameness of vision. Was convinced and convinced others that what he saw was there. Fry found the word he wanted, but Woolf, using narration much as she does in her novel To the Lighthouse, withholds from us what that word was. Slowly, gradually, found the word he wanted, cedes to wordless humility and the fierce conviction that what he saw was there. A movement whereby, through a process akin to mimetic desire, the audience began to experience what Fry saw, experienced with him a sameness of vision. A few years ago, I was in Edinburgh and went with my father to hear the pianist Alfred Brendel give an illustrated talk about Beethoven's piano sonatas. We were late and arrived at the hall breathless and sweaty, but all was serene inside. Brendel sat at a table with a concert grand piano behind him. He talked, or mumbled rather, from his lecture notes, peering down at his text through thick spectacles. He has a strong Austrian accent, unaffected by decades of living in England. Every so often, he would turn to the piano to play a few bars as illustration. But something remarkable occurred when he quoted. Even to play a short phrase, he became not a quoter but a performer, not merely a critic, but an artist critic. Physically, he had to enter the trance-like state in which he performs whole concerts, his customary shudderings, phantom mastication, closed eyes, swooning and tilting. He could not blandly quote the music in the way that one might read a line from French without bothering to put on the proper French accent. He had to become, as it were, French. In this sense, he could not quote. He could only recreate, which is to say, he could only create. It was intensely frustrating to hear, again and again, 3 bars of the most beautiful Beethoven, perfectly performed, only to have them break off and be replaced by the pianist's inaudible Viennese mumbling. Play on, don't talk," I soundlessly urged. The mumbling quickly became of no interest or importance. One lived for the next pianistic performance. One was swinging from beauty to beauty, high above the dun currents of the prosaic. His quotes overwhelmed his commentary. He was approaching Walter Benjamin's idea of a book entirely made of quotations. Perhaps the analogy with literary criticism is imperfect because the critic lacks this precise ability to inflect his chosen quotes as the musician can perform his. But let Brendel's wordy mumbling stand for a kind of literary criticism condemned to exteriority, a writing about rather than a writing through the text, a flat commentary banished from the heart of the creative. And let Brendel's performance on the piano, his inability to quote without also creating, stand for the kind of criticism that is a writing through a text, the kind of criticism that is at once critique and redescription. Thank you. I don't know if there's time for questions or if you want to. It's 25 to. I'm happy to take a couple of questions if anyone is interested. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. And I have a question that's very basic, I think. You cited Woolf's essay on aspects of the novel, and noted that it was a book review and that we were citing it as though it were a canonical essay, because it in fact has become a canonical essay. And so as professor of practice of literary criticism, it seems to me that you're possibly uniquely situated to talk about something that I've often wondered about, which is that there are two things that we call criticism, that, and it's not entirely clear where the distinction is, and I think that that's always been the case, and the distinction has perhaps not always been in the same place, even at any given moment for that matter, which is to say criticism as book reviewing and criticism in terms of academic criticism. And I was struck by the passionate redescription, which is a wonderful phrase, but it's also, to some extent, what we try to get our students not to do in their papers often. So I guess my question is what do you see as the relation between these two forms of criticism, literary criticism?
Yeah, that's a really tremendous question. We all couldn't help laughing when you said the thing about it's what you try to get your students not to do. And I suppose this is something that really involves me as a question. The question of performance and revoicing, passionate redescription that necessarily goes on in a review, but that would be de trop in a academic context. I mean, it would be unnecessary. It would be absurd to write an essay certainly about any canonical book in which you addressed your fellow academics as if they didn't know what it was about, and then tried to lure them into a vicarious rereading of it.
No, you have to preface it by as you'll recall.
As you'll recall, that's right. So, yeah, that does seem a signal difference, doesn't it? I mean, Henry James has this line where he says, the critic is heroically vicarious. I'm not quite sure about the heroic element. It doesn't seem that heroic most of the time. But the vicariousness is I think, the crucial difference. That in some way, when you at least review the book for the first time, you're putting yourself in the position of the first reader, and therefore experiencing those things for the first reader. And that's why returning to it a few years later with, say, the example of the Teju Cole would be such a different experience. Ideally, it'd be nice to have both together, wouldn't it? Sometimes, occasionally, you'll read an essay by a student where you feel that a certain amount of, just the permitted amount, should we say, of passionate redescription has gone on. And then, the formal analysis kicks in. But I'm not sure that I know what the connection is, and I truly feel divided about the different roles. I could just tell you as a matter of practice what I try to do in my review is a bit of both. So insofar as I can, I try to do that primary thing of vicariously reading for the reader, getting the reader to engage in this sameness of vision, blah, blah. And then, as it were, like someone who's taken a sort of pill to age himself very quickly, I try to have a sort of instant retrospective alienation from the thing, right? Even though I've only, like with the Cole, I had sort of 2 weeks, whatever, to quickly review it. The ideal, I think, is always to be removing oneself from that primary thing of performance and trying to think as critically as possible about the book, about its context, about why it's been written, and so on. But I think that's where one is liable as a regular reviewer to fail and fall down. Always I hear in my ear the thing that Randall Jarrell used to say, how would you have reviewed Moby Dick when it came out in 1851? And I'm pretty sure the answer would be, I would have sort of trashed it. I mean, I don't think I would have given it, I would probably say, it's overblown, doesn't have any form. I hope not, but that's the fear. So always I think for me, it's this thing of trying to have second and third guesses. Yeah.
In your book, How Fiction Works, you have this wonderful explication of free indirect narration in which you show the way that the writer, the narrator, and the character can get blurred in this kind of wonderful way that allows the reader to feel, even through the narration, that they're entering into the inner life of the character. And it struck me that you were talking about really the same thing in your goal with literary criticism, in which you feel that the literary critic, the review itself, is entering into the sensibility of the writer, and that the reader is getting a sort of taste of the writer through the review. And so I wondered if you thought about that parallel.
That's really good. No, I hadn't at all. That's excellent. That's absolutely true. I mean, I'm completely obsessed by free and direct style.
I am too, totally.
Yeah. Because it can exist in one word. That's what I love about it. It can just be one word that brings all the attention to the fact that that's what's going on.
I think you use that word angrily in that passage. You have which you show, which is unclear whether sort of who that angrily belongs to, and it's always struck me as something about the mystery of what happens in empathy, where the boundaries get very blurred, and that's kind of the magic of fiction.
Yeah. I think one of my favorites is from Penelope Fitzgerald's The Blue Flower, where she's writing about how Fritz, the young philosopher Novalis, keeps on telling her all about Fichte, telling Carolina Just, who is a 27-year-old housekeeper, essentially, and who's always working when he's always blabbing on about philosophy, tellingly. But there's a line, something like, as she chopped onions, she learnt that the world tended not towards destruction, but infinity. And it's all there in that verb learned, right? It's just one single word alerts you to the fact that the author that the language has gone over to Carolina's side, ironically, and that of course it's a preposterous thing to no one can learn that while you chop onions. So that anyway, I could blab on for eternity, but I hadn't thought about that thing of disappearing. That's thank you very much for raising that. I won't outstay my welcome, so thank you very much for coming.